They appear in only a handful of ancient lines, yet those lines have echoed for millennia. The Nephilim were on the earth in those days, and also afterward. Were they giants of flesh and bone, towering above early humanity, or visitors from beyond the stars, whose arrival reshaped the course of history? In the faint ink of scripture and the weathered grooves of stone, their shadow stretches across civilizations, from the deserts of Mesopotamia to the high temples of Mesoamerica. Archaeologists brush dust from tablets that whisper of beings who descended from the heavens. Astronomers chart alignments in ancient ruins that seem to watch the same constellations our ancestors did. And in between these fragments, truth flickers, elusive, like a signal buried in cosmic noise. Tonight, we will walk through those fragments. We will stand before the monoliths, read the oldest words carved by human hands, and listen for what was meant to be remembered, or perhaps hidden. So lean closer. Let the noise of the present fade. This is not just history. It's an invitation into the unknown. Welcome to Deformed History. Our journey into the mystery of the Nephilim begins now. If you're drawn to stories like these, the ones that live in the shadows between what we see and what was made to disappear, feel free to like and subscribe only if it feels right. And let me know in the comments, where are you watching from? And what time is it for you right now? I love seeing our little map of watchers light up around the world. The story begins quietly, almost too quietly, in the 6th chapter of Genesis, in the oldest layers of the Hebrew Bible. It is a short, dense passage, no more than a few lines, yet its meaning has been debated for centuries. When human beings began to increase in number on the earth, and daughters were born to them, the sons of God saw that the daughters of humans were beautiful, and they married any of them they chose. The Nephilim were on the earth in those days, and also afterward, when the sons of God went to the daughters of humans and had children by them. They were the heroes of old, men of renown. It is here, in this compressed, almost cryptic narrative, that the Nephilim step onto the stage of human memory. They arrive not as detailed characters, but as a name, a presence. There is no genealogy, no elaborate introduction, only the suggestion of something strange, a mingling of the human and the divine, a crossing of boundaries forbidden and yet irresistible. To the ancient Hebrew listener, these words were already heavy with meaning. The phrase, sons of God, B'nai Ha-Elohim, was not casual poetry. In the Semitic cultures surrounding Israel, such a phrase often referred to beings from the heavenly realm, angels, divine council members, or lesser gods in polytheistic pantheons. The daughters of humans were mortal women, the daughters of Adam's line. The union of these two worlds was a transgression, but one that produced something extraordinary: the Nephilim. The name itself carries an aura of ambiguity. In Hebrew, Nephilim may come from the root NPL, to fall, suggesting the fallen ones. Some scholars have taken this as moral, fallen from grace. Others have read it physically, fallen upon others, like warriors who strike down their enemies. The Septuagint, the ancient Greek translation of the Hebrew Bible, rendered the term as gigantes, giants, cementing the image of immense, superhuman beings in the Western imagination. But the Hebrew does not require such a literal height. It could refer to power, dominance, or strangeness. In Israel's early history, this passage may have carried echoes of older, shared myths from the region. In Mesopotamia, the Sumerians told of the Anunnaki, skyborn deities who interacted with humans in a time before the Great Flood. In Ugarit, coastal Canaanite texts speak of divine sons and their dealings with mortals. The Genesis account seems to distill this wider mythic world into a brief but loaded statement, enough to acknowledge the idea, but not enough to explain it. Perhaps the writers did not wish to glorify the Nephilim. Perhaps they assumed the audience already knew the stories. And yet, the placement of the Nephilim in Genesis is telling. They appear right before the account of the Great Flood. In the narrative flow, their existence seems to be part of the corruption that leads to the flood judgment. The mingling of heaven and earth, the violence of these beings, the possible disruption of the created order, all of it hints at a world spiraling out of balance. If we read carefully, the Nephilim are not merely curiosities. They are an omen. The question remains, were the Nephilim singular individuals or an entire class of beings? The texts in those days, and also afterward, suggests that their presence was not limited to the pre-flood era. Later, in the Book of Numbers, Israelite spies report seeing giants in Canaan, descendants of the Nephilim, before Israel's conquest of the land. The implication is unsettling. Whatever they were, they did not vanish completely in the deluge. Here, the story brushes against the border between history and myth. We have ancient names, rooted in a real cultural setting, but their precise nature escapes the kind of clarity modern readers expect. To the Israelites, the Nephilim might have been both real and symbolic, ancestral enemies remembered as monstrous in size and spirit, whose origins were tangled with the heavens themselves. To understand the weight of this, we have to step into the worldview of an ancient audience. In their minds, the cosmos was not a closed system. The heavens were populated, layered, inhabited by ranks of spiritual beings. Earth was the middle ground where divine and mortal realms could touch, and sometimes clash. The Nephilim occupied a dangerous intersection, living proof that the boundaries set by God in creation could be crossed. When Genesis speaks of them as heroes of old, men of renown, it touches on something almost universal. The memory of a golden age when beings greater than humans walked the earth. Many cultures have their own version. The Greek heroes, children of gods and mortals, the Sumerian kings of impossible reign lengths, the demigods of the Pacific Islands. The Nephilim are Israel's version, stripped of romanticism, framed instead as part of the world's corruption. The brevity of the biblical account forces us to ask, what was left unsaid? Did the scribes deliberately condense a sprawling myth into a warning? Was it to steer the people away from reverence for these beings? Or did the memory of the Nephilim persist because it was rooted in something that could not be entirely forgotten, whether that was a real people, a hybrid lineage, or a deep cultural archetype? And this is where the mystery deepens. The Nephilim are not described in the detail we crave. They are a shadow, a whisper, a name dropped into the stream of sacred history. Their story will not be told here in full, but that omission invites us to search elsewhere, in the dust of ancient cities, on the tablets of vanished languages, in the myths of lands far from the Jordan River. We may find reflections of them. For now, in this first glimpse, we meet them only through the tight lens of Scripture. They stand at the threshold between heaven and earth, between the human and the impossible. Their presence turns the early chapters of Genesis from a pastoral prelude into something darker, stranger, and far more ancient than we might have imagined. They are the Nephilim, named but not explained, and from this point forward, their shadow will follow us through the corridors of time. When we step beyond the narrow columns of the Hebrew text, the shadows of the Nephilim begin to lengthen, stretching across oceans and centuries. It is as if fragments of their story have drifted like seeds on the wind into the myths of distant peoples. And here, in the echo chambers of ancient literature, we find other names, other shapes, bearing an uncanny resemblance. In the Sumerian Enuma Elish, the oldest creation epic yet uncovered, the heavens are not empty. They are alive with beings of immense power. Among them are the Anunnaki, those who came down from the heavens. They are not portrayed as mere spirits, but as rulers, judges, and in some cases, bringers of knowledge and technology to humanity. On the weathered clay tablets, inscribed in cuneiform thousands of years before Genesis was written, their descent is both a gift and a disruption, forever altering the course of human life. The parallels with the sons of God in Genesis are difficult to ignore. In another Mesopotamian text, the Atrahasis, the divine beings grow weary of their labors and create humans to serve them. But there is a twist. Some of these beings, tasked with watching over humanity, break their station. They mingle with mortals, altering the destiny of both worlds. It is a story that runs so close to the biblical Watchers and Nephilim that one wonders if these were different dialects of the same ancient memory. Far from the floodplains of Mesopotamia, in the highlands of Guatemala, the Popol Vuh, the sacred book of the Quiche Maya, tells of powerful beings who shaped the first humans from maize and blood. The early humans, in these accounts, were not weak. They could see far, understand the mysteries of the cosmos, and walk as equals with their creators. But such power frightened the gods, who clouded human vision, diminishing them. Here, the theme of a divine-human overlap, followed by a deliberate severing, appears again. Though the Maya do not speak of giants, the essence is similar. There was a time when the boundary between the mortal and the divine was thinner, and beings of greater stature walked among us. In the Rig Veda of ancient India, the Vedic poets sing of the Devas, shining ones, and their enemies, the Asuras. These battles are often cosmic, but the texts also describe unions between gods and mortals, producing heroes with extraordinary abilities. The Mahabharata, India's great epic, tells of warriors with superhuman size, strength, and lifespans born from such unions. Some are noble, others destructive, but all are marked as different, set apart from ordinary humanity. When we map these myths side by side, a pattern emerges. In each, we see a realm beyond Earth populated by powerful beings, a transgression or crossing of the mortal divine boundary, offspring or creations marked by unusual size, strength, or intellect. A shift in the order of the world, often ending in catastrophe or deliberate suppression. It is tempting, from a modern perspective, to treat these parallels as coincidence, as the inevitable outcome of human imagination confronting the mysteries of life and the stars. But there is another possibility, one that scholars like Zechariah Sitchin and Graham Hancock have dared to explore. What if these are not separate myths, but fractured pieces of a single, much older story, a story passed down and reshaped by each culture, retaining its bones even as the details changed? Sitchin, reading the Sumerian tablets through his controversial lens, argued that the Anunnaki were not gods in the spiritual sense, but flesh and blood visitors from another world, possibly the planet he called Nibiru. In his framework, the Nephilim of the Bible are simply another name for the same beings. The descent from heaven becomes literal space travel. The unions with human women become early genetic experimentation. The giants are the result of crossbreeding between two species. Mainstream scholars dismiss such ideas as speculative, but the allure lies in how neatly the puzzle pieces seem to fit. Yet we must tread carefully. Ancient texts are not blueprints. They are mosaics of symbolism, theology, and oral tradition. In the Enuma Elish, the god's descent might be political metaphor. In the Popol Vuh, the creator's fear of their own creations could be moral teaching. In the Rig Veda, divine human unions may represent alliances between tribes, clothed in cosmic language. The danger lies in flattening these myths into a single, literal narrative. Still, the recurrence of such themes across vast distances remains one of history's most tantalizing patterns. Archaeology, too, adds its own quiet voice to the conversation. In Mesopotamia, colossal statues guard the gates of ancient cities, human in shape, but with the wings of eagles and the faces of lions. In the Andes, walls of stone fit so tightly together that not even a blade of grass can slip between them, as if crafted by hands that understood stone on a scale beyond our own. In the Pacific, the Moai of Easter Island stand like sentinels, their heads enormous compared to their torsos, gazing over the horizon. While none of these prove the existence of Nephilim or their analogues, they feed the human instinct to wonder whether these monuments were built in memory of beings who once inspired both awe and fear. The question becomes not just who the Nephilim were, but why so many cultures tell a story of beings who are almost human, yet not quite. Did these cultures independently imagine such beings because the idea resonates with something in the human psyche? Or did they all inherit fragments of a shared encounter, passed down through generations, embroidered and transformed but never entirely lost? In the quiet moments between the lines of these ancient texts, there is a strange familiarity. The Anunnaki standing before humanity, the Maya gods shaping maze men, the Vedic heroes born of heaven and earth, all could stand beside the Nephilim in some vast, untold epic. They might wear different names, speak different tongues, and live under different stars, but their outlines overlap. For now, the biblical account remains the most austere of these versions, stripped of the rich detail found in other traditions. But it is precisely this sparseness that invites the connections. It is as if Genesis has given us only a name and an echo, and the rest of the ancient world has been whispering the backstory for thousands of years. As we leave this web of parallels, one thing becomes clear. The Nephilim do not stand alone. They belong to a family of myths that stretches from the temples of Babylon to the jungles of Mesoamerica and the plains of India. Whether this family is born of shared memory or shared imagination is the mystery we carry forward. And so, with the Bible's few lines as our anchor and the world's myths as our map, we turn to the next question. What tangible traces, if any, did these beings leave behind? If the Nephilim were more than legend, then their presence should have left scars on the earth, monuments, tools, or ruins that stretch beyond the scale of ordinary human hands. And across the ancient world, there are sites where stone itself seems to carry the memory of something immense. One such place lies in the fertile Bekaa Valley of Lebanon, Baalbek. Here, amid the remains of a Roman temple complex, lie 3 colossal stone blocks, each over 800 tons, cut with geometric precision, resting in a retaining wall. Nearby, still embedded in the quarry, lies the Stone of the Pregnant Woman, estimated at over 1,000 tons. Modern cranes would strain to lift it, yet these stones were shaped and positioned thousands of years ago. Orthodox archaeology attributes the placement to Roman engineering, but some researchers note that the largest blocks seem older than the Roman layers that rest upon them, possible remnants of an earlier, unknown phase of construction. In the language of alternative history, Baalbek becomes a candidate for Nephilim architecture, a stage for giants, or for those who worked alongside them. Farther east, in the deserts of Mesopotamia, fragments of ancient cities still bear the marks of chisel and hammer. Excavations at sites like Uruk and Nineveh have uncovered not only palaces, but also colossal statues, lamassu, winged, human-headed bulls that guard gateways. Standing up to 14 feet tall, they are imposing even today. The lamassu are often seen as mythic protectors, but for some, they are symbolic portraits of a reality. Beings of immense stature and power who once walked among humans. Then there are the inscriptions. Cuneiform tablets, their wedge-shaped signs pressed into clay, sometimes speak of beings whose size defies normality. In the Epic of Gilgamesh, the eponymous hero is described as 2/3 divine and 1/3 human, with a height and strength unmatched. Gilgamesh himself is not called a Nephilim in any direct sense. His culture did not use that word, but his hybrid nature and towering presence place him in the same mythic category. The New World offers its own enigmas. In the Andean highlands at Sacsayhuaman near Cusco, the walls are built from massive polygonal stones, some weighing over 100 tons. Each fits into the next with such precision that mortar is unnecessary. Archaeologists credit the Inca with the construction, yet even the Inca, when asked by early Spanish chroniclers, claimed the walls were the work of giants in a forgotten age. Similar legends persist on Easter Island, where the Rapa Nui say the Moai, the great stone heads, were walked into place by a force now lost. In North America, the 19th and early 20th centuries saw a wave of newspaper reports about the discovery of giant skeletons in burial mounds across the Midwest and Appalachia. Many of these accounts, published in local papers, described skeletons measuring 7 to 9 feet in height. The Smithsonian Institution and other academic bodies dismissed most of these claims as exaggerations or outright hoaxes, pointing to the absence of properly documented specimens. Still, the stories persist, fed by a mix of folklore, mistrust of institutions, and the tantalizing idea that such remains were quietly removed from public view. Skepticism is necessary. After all, extraordinary claims demand extraordinary evidence. Yet the human imagination keeps circling back to these sites and stories. In the alternative history community, they form a mosaic of clues suggesting that giants, or those remembered as giants, left their fingerprints across the planet. Sometimes the clues are more symbolic than physical. Petroglyphs in the American Southwest depict figures with elongated limbs and radiating headdresses that some interpret as helmets or crowns. In Africa's Great Zimbabwe ruins, the scale and precision of the stone enclosures led early European explorers to speculate about a vanished race of builders. In Asia, the sheer size of some standing Buddhas, like the Bamiyan statues destroyed in Afghanistan in 2001, suggests that monumental art has long been used to enshrine the idea of beings larger than life. But the strongest cases for a physical connection to the Nephilim myth come when scale meets antiquity, and when that antiquity precedes the cultures we can name. Göbekli Tepe, in modern-day Turkey, dates back over 11,000 years, making it older than Stonehenge or the pyramids. Its T-shaped stone pillars, some over 15 feet tall and weighing up to 20 tons, are carved with animals and abstract symbols. The people who built it had no known system of writing, no metal tools, and yet they organized a construction project on a monumental scale. Mainstream archaeology sees this as proof of early social complexity. Others wonder if Göbekli Tepe is a surviving fragment of a lost, advanced culture, one whose memory might intertwine with the legends of Nephilim or other first builders. Artifacts, too, invite speculation. Oversized stone tools, axes, pestles, and grinding stones sometimes emerge from ancient layers. Mainstream explanations are that they were ceremonial or symbolic, not functional. But to those chasing the Nephilim trail, such objects are seen as possible remnants of a people for whom these sizes were practical. And then there are the star maps. In some cases, ancient carvings seem to record astronomical knowledge far beyond what their cultures should have possessed. The ceiling of the Dendera temple in Egypt contains a detailed zodiac. The ruins of Nabta Playa, deep in the Egyptian desert, align with the rising of Sirius and Orion's belt, constellations often linked in alternative theories to celestial visitors. If the Nephilim were indeed tied to the sons of God who descended from the heavens, then such astronomical connections could be read as their calling card. Of course, each of these sites and artifacts has explanations within the framework of human ingenuity, local tradition, and cultural exchange. Yet their combined effect is like a low-frequency hum, subtle, persistent, hard to ignore. Even for the skeptic, there is something unsettling about the way these traces seem to cluster around the same themes: beings of great size or strength, feats of construction that strain our sense of ancient capability, and legends of contact between heaven and earth. Whether these are the true fingerprints of the Nephilim, or simply the enduring mark of humanity's fascination with the extraordinary, they form the tangible backdrop to our search. The stones will not speak plainly, but they remain monuments to something or someone who inspired awe powerful enough to outlast civilizations. In the next step of our journey, we will leave the stones behind and return to the texts, specifically those writings outside the canon of the Bible, where the Nephilim take on clearer forms and more detailed stories. There, in the pages of Enoch and other forgotten works, the shadows grow sharper. In the official pages of the Bible, the Nephilim are shadows, named but not described in detail, their origins and fate largely unspoken. But outside the biblical canon, in texts once read by early Jewish communities and later set aside, the shadows sharpen into figures. These are the apocryphal and pseudepigraphal works, writings attributed to ancient prophets or patriarchs, often blending history, myth, and moral vision. Among them, none looms larger in the story of the Nephilim than the Book of Enoch. Enoch, or more precisely, First Enoch, was never included in the Hebrew Bible, though it survives in full in the Ethiopian Orthodox canon and in fragments from the Dead Sea Scrolls. Its language is vivid, almost cinematic. Here, the sons of God, from Genesis 6, are given a name: The Watchers. They are not vague celestial beings, but specific entities, described as descending to earth on Mount Hermon. 200 of them, led by chiefs like Semyaza and Azazel, take human wives. Their unions produce the Nephilim, now unmistakably portrayed as giants, immense in size, insatiable in appetite, consuming not only human food, but eventually humans themselves. The text paints a world spiraling toward chaos. The Nephilim, in their hunger, devour the earth's resources, teaching violence and bloodshed. The Watchers, meanwhile, share forbidden knowledge with humanity: metallurgy and weapon-making, the arts of enchantment, the secrets of the heavens. Azazel is singled out for teaching humans how to forge swords and shields. Others teach astrology, the reading of signs, the use of cosmetics. The Book of Enoch treats these as corruptions, gifts that were never meant to be given, knowledge that accelerates humanity's descent into sin. It is a striking contrast to the brevity of Genesis, where the Bible compresses the Nephilim into a few enigmatic lines. Enoch turns their story into an epic of rebellion, corruption, and impending judgment. The flood, in this telling, is not simply a reaction to human wickedness, but a direct response to the havoc wrought by the Watchers and their offspring. God commands the archangels, Michael, Gabriel, Raphael, Uriel, to act. The Nephilim are to be destroyed in battle, their spirits condemned to wander the earth as evil spirits. The Watchers are bound and cast into the abyss until the final judgment. The Book of Jubilees, another ancient Jewish text, echoes much of this narrative, though in a more compressed form. Written in a style that retells biblical history with additional details, Jubilees repeats the idea that angelic beings descended and fathered giant children. It places their story firmly in the context of pre-flood corruption and divine judgment. Like Enoch, it sees the Nephilim not as noble heroes, but as destroyers of the created order. Fragments from the Dead Sea Scrolls, particularly from Cave 4 at Qumran, confirmed that these stories were not fringe material in the Second Temple period. Multiple copies of Enoch and related giant texts were preserved alongside biblical manuscripts. One fragment, often called the Book of Giants, offers tantalizing glimpses into a now lost narrative. Here, the Nephilim have names: Ohia, Hahia, Mawe, and dreams foretelling their doom. In one vision, a giant sees a tablet submerged in water and lifted away, leaving only 3 names, a prophecy of the flood's survivors. These fragments are broken, incomplete, but they pulse with the same strange energy, a sense that in some deep past, beings larger than life once challenged both heaven and earth. Why were these accounts left out of the biblical canon? For some scholars, the answer is practical. The stories were popular but not universally accepted, and as the canon formed, only certain texts made the cut. For others, the omission was deliberate, a move to narrow the theological focus, to avoid inflaming speculation about angelic beings, forbidden knowledge, and divine-human hybrids. By leaving the Nephilim vague, the Bible kept the mystery while sidestepping the full unsettling implications. And yet, these extra-biblical works continued to shape thought. Early Christian writers like Tertullian and Irenaeus accepted the Enoch account as true, seeing the Watchers as literal angels who sinned. Later, theologians such as Augustine reinterpreted Genesis 6 as metaphor, reading sons of God as human descendants of Seth, marrying daughters of Cain, thus stripping the story of its supernatural dimension. but the older, stranger reading never entirely vanished. What makes the Enoch tradition compelling is its specificity. It gives the Nephilim a life beyond the abstract. We see them growing from infants to titans, unleashing terror on the earth. We see the Watchers making a fateful choice, knowing it will bring divine wrath. We see the moral thread. Knowledge without wisdom is ruin. Power without restraint is violence. These themes resonate far beyond theology, touching the core of human storytelling. For the modern seeker, the Enoch account opens two doors. Through one, we see an allegory of corruption, how power, knowledge, and desire can twist both mortals and immortals. Through the other, we glimpse the possibility, no matter how remote, that these were real events, dimly remembered. The descent on Mount Hermon, the teaching of forbidden arts, the flood as a cosmic reset, all could be read, in the language of alternative history, as encounters with non-human intelligences, refracted through the world-view of the ancient Near East. Even mainstream archaeology acknowledges that Mount Hermon, straddling modern Lebanon and Syria, is rich with ancient sites, megalithic structures, temples, and dolmens whose origins are still debated. To some, these are mere cultural artifacts. To others, they are silent witnesses to the era of the Watchers. The apocryphal accounts also preserve a detail that invites comparison with other cultures: the fate of the Nephilim after death. In Enoch, their physical bodies perish, but their spirits remain on earth as evil spirits, wandering and afflicting humanity. This idea parallels beliefs in restless giant spirits in Norse sagas, the demons of Mesopotamian lore, and certain Native American traditions of malevolent star people whose power lingered long after their bodies fell. In these pages outside the canon, the Nephilim are no longer a footnote. They are a central drama. They are named, feared, judged, and remembered. Whether one reads these texts as inspired history or as myth-making, they reveal how deeply the Nephilim had sunk into the ancient imagination. From here, our path will turn toward the giants in flesh, not in the realm of words, but in the bones, skulls, and artifacts that have been claimed, for better or worse, as their remains. In the world of anthropology and archaeology, these claims are contentious, often dismissed, but they remain part of the long shadow the Nephilim cast over human history. In the realm of alternative history, one question has lingered for decades. What if the Nephilim were not purely mythical beings or supernatural hybrids, but visitors from another world? This is the core of the ancient astronaut hypothesis, a theory popularized in the late 20th century by authors like Erich von Däniken, Zecharia Sitchin, and later amplified through documentaries, television series, and conferences. It's a proposition that moves the discussion of Genesis 6 from theology into the domain of contact between early humanity and an intelligence that did not originate on Earth. Zecharia Sitchin, in particular, placed the Nephilim at the center of this reinterpretation. In his 1976 book, The 12th Planet, Sitchin argued that the Sumerian texts, the cuneiform tablets from ancient Mesopotamia, described a race called the Anunnaki, who came to Earth from a distant planet, which he named Nibiru. In his reading, the Anunnaki's arrival was not metaphorical, but literal, a technologically advanced species traveling across space, establishing outposts on Earth and interacting with early humans. According to Sitchin, the Nephilim of the Bible and the Anunnaki of Sumer were one and the same. Sitchin's work rests on the parallels between the biblical sons of God and the Mesopotamian accounts of gods descending from the heavens. Where traditional scholars read these as divine myths, Sitchin saw a garbled but factual account of extraterrestrial visitation. The union of the sons of God with the daughters of men became, in his telling, a program of genetic engineering, a deliberate mixing of their species with ours, producing hybrid offspring. In this scenario, the giants of old were not a result of random mutation or poetic exaggeration, but the direct outcome of a controlled experiment by beings with knowledge far beyond human capacity. Erich von Däniken's Chariots of the Gods, 1968, took a broader approach, pointing to megalithic structures, precise astronomical alignments, and ancient artworks as evidence of a global pattern of contact. He didn't focus on the Nephilim by name, but the overlap is clear. The recurring theme of gods who come from the sky, bring knowledge, and in some cases physically interbreed with humans. Von Däniken argued that many ancient myths are misremembered encounters with advanced visitors whom our ancestors could only describe using the language of divinity. Supporters of the ancient astronaut hypothesis often point to specific biblical passages that, in their view, take on new meaning under this lens. The phrase "came down" in Genesis 6 becomes a descent from orbit. The Watcher's teaching of metallurgy and astronomy in Enoch becomes a transfer of advanced technology. The destruction of the Nephilim in the flood becomes a planetary reset, wiping out evidence of an earlier phase of human history that was guided, or interfered with, by outsiders. They also note that certain archaeological puzzles seem to fit this framework. For example, the construction of sites like Pumapunku in Bolivia, with its precisely cut stone blocks and complex joinery, appears to some as beyond the capabilities of the cultures we know existed at the time. Likewise, the alignment of ancient monuments to celestial events, such as the pyramids of Giza with Orion's belt, could be seen as the fingerprints of a culture with a deep astronomical knowledge, perhaps learned from those who came from the stars. Critics, of course, counter that these interpretations rest on selective readings, mistranslations, or underestimation of ancient human ingenuity. They argue that there is no physical evidence, no alien artifacts, no unambiguous hybrid skeletons that confirm the existence of extraterrestrial contact. For mainstream scholars, the Nephilim remain within the realm of myth, moral storytelling, or at most, exaggerated accounts of real but entirely human peoples. Still, the ancient astronaut hypothesis persists, fueled not only by books and television, but by a deep human intuition. The feeling that our species' leap into civilization happened too quickly to be explained by gradual development alone. The archaeological record shows sudden bursts of complexity, writing systems, monumental architecture, advanced metallurgy, that emerge in multiple places with little apparent prelude. For some, these are the fingerprints of a guiding hand. Sitchin went further, suggesting that the Anunnaki came to Earth seeking gold, not for ornamentation, but to use as a means of repairing their planet's atmosphere. In this reading, humanity was engineered as a labor force, designed to mine resources. The interbreeding with human women, then, was not simply curiosity or desire, but a way of creating beings who could survive on Earth while carrying traits from their creators. This controversial claim reframes the Nephilim as both a byproduct and a side effect of a larger project. Other researchers, like Robert Temple, The Sirius Mystery, and more recently, Giorgio A. Tsoukalos, have connected the Nephilim narrative to a wider pattern of sky god myths found on every continent. In Aboriginal Australian Dreamtime stories, star beings descend to teach sacred laws. In Dogon tradition from Mali, amphibious beings from Sirius bring knowledge of the stars. In Mesoamerican legend, Quetzalcoatl arrives as a bearded, robed figure from across the sea, bringing science and agriculture. These patterns don't prove a shared origin, but they do create a compelling network of mythic parallels. Under the ancient astronaut lens, the Nephilim become part of a much larger, global story, a story in which early humanity was never alone. The boundaries between gods, angels, and extraterrestrials blur. The Watchers could be understood as advanced beings stationed in orbit or on Earth to observe and guide. The giants could be the literal result of incompatible genetics manifesting in unusual size or physical traits. Even the flood becomes part of an interstellar cleanup operation, erasing a failed experiment. Yet even those sympathetic to the theory acknowledge its speculative nature. The lack of direct physical evidence means the hypothesis lives in the space between archaeology and imagination. Its strength lies not in proof, but in pattern recognition, in seeing the same motifs arise independently in distant cultures and asking whether coincidence is enough to explain it. For believers, the ancient astronaut hypothesis offers a provocative resolution to the mystery of the Nephilim. They were neither wholly human nor purely divine. They were emissaries from another world, genetic pioneers, rulers, and perhaps rebels, whose time on Earth ended in cataclysm, but whose memory endured in sacred texts and stone. For skeptics, the same hypothesis is a cautionary tale about reading modern ideas into ancient stories, a reminder that humans have always looked to the skies for our origins. Whether the Nephilim were angels, aliens, or allegories, the ancient astronaut theory keeps the question alive. It refuses to let the Nephilim fade into the mists of theology alone. Instead, it plants them squarely in the realm of history, possibly in the vast and mysterious history of more than one world. From here, we turn to a different kind of evidence, not myths or megaliths, but bones and bodies. In the next stage of our journey, we will examine the controversial anthropological claims of giant skeletons, elongated skulls, and other remains said to belong to the Nephilim's flesh and blood legacy. If the Nephilim once walked the earth in flesh and blood, then somewhere, buried beneath layers of soil and centuries of forgetfulness, their bones should remain. That's the premise that has driven explorers, amateur archaeologists, and fringe researchers for over a century to search for the skeletal echoes of these ancient giants. And though mainstream science has never confirmed the discovery of such remains, the annals of history, especially the 19th and early 20th centuries, are filled with accounts that challenge the official silence. The most famous of these come from North America. During the great era of mound exploration in the United States, when settlers and antiquarians were excavating Native American burial mounds from Ohio to Wisconsin, newspaper headlines occasionally blared with astonishing claims. Skeletons 8, 9, even 10 feet tall, with massive skulls and teeth the size of a man's thumb. These reports appeared in local papers like the San Antonio Express, 1919, the New York Times, several times in the late 1800s, and dozens of small-town gazettes. They often described burial chambers containing multiple oversized skeletons, sometimes with weapons or tools proportionally large. The Smithsonian Institution's own field reports from the 19th century occasionally recorded skeletons in the 7-foot range, remarkable, though not impossible for humans, before those bones vanished into collections or were dismissed as anomalies. Over time, a narrative took hold among alternative historians that the Smithsonian and other institutions had quietly removed and hidden evidence of giants to preserve the prevailing anthropological model. The Smithsonian has categorically denied such claims, insisting that no such remains exist in their possession. Beyond the United States, giant skeleton claims emerge in scattered reports. In the 1950s, miners in Namibia reportedly unearthed a partial femur so large that it would have belonged to a human over 12 feet tall. In the 1930s, in the Philippines, the skeleton of a man over 8 feet tall was allegedly discovered in a limestone cave. In the 1960s, road workers in southeastern Turkey uncovered what they claimed were enormous human bones near the ancient city of Smyrna. In Lovelock Cave, Nevada, excavators in the early 20th century reported finding the remains of unusually tall individuals tied to Paiute legends of red-haired giants who once inhabited the area. Anthropologists point out that many such stories lack verifiable documentation. Photographs, where they exist, are often grainy, misattributed, or suspected hoaxes. In some cases, oversized bones turn out to belong not to humans, but to extinct megafauna, such as mammoths or mastodons. In others, natural conditions like acromegaly, a disorder caused by excess growth hormone, can produce unusually large individuals whose remains might inspire exaggerated tales. And yet, the persistence of these stories fuels suspicion. Why do so many different cultures and regions produce similar claims? Why do the skeletons themselves so often vanish into private hands or institutional archives? Even in the absence of verified remains, the Nephilim narrative finds echoes in the human fossil record. Homo heidelbergensis, an extinct human species, could reach heights over 6 feet and was powerfully built. Neanderthals, while shorter, were robust, with thick bones and heavy musculature. These were not giants in the biblical sense, but they demonstrate that ancient humans were capable of physical builds that would have seemed formidable to later generations. Then there are the long bone anomalies, occasionally unearthed in archaeological digs, isolated femurs or tibias that suggest an individual much taller than the population average. The elongated skull phenomenon adds another layer to the discussion. In Peru's Paracas Peninsula, archaeologist Julio Tello unearthed dozens of skulls with extreme elongation, more than could be achieved by known head-binding practices. While cranial deformation is a well-documented cultural practice in many parts of the world, some of the Paracas skulls have cranial capacity measurements significantly above the human average. DNA tests conducted in recent years, often criticized for lack of peer review, have fueled speculation about non-human ancestry. Could these skulls represent a lineage connected, however distantly, to the Nephilim or their analogues? Legends, too, tie into the physical claims. In parts of the South Pacific, oral histories speak of tall ones who came before, leaving behind stone platforms and burial sites too large for the current population to have built. In the Caucasus Mountains, stories persist of giant warriors whose bones were once displayed in village shrines. In Basque tradition, the Gentilak, Giants who built dolmens and megaliths vanished with the coming of Christianity, leaving only their graves behind. Mainstream science treats all such stories as folklore, useful for understanding cultural identity, but not as evidence of a lost race. Yet alternative researchers argue that the consistency of these accounts, coupled with scattered physical anomalies, points toward an ancient truth half remembered and half buried. Even the Bible, in Numbers 13:33, records the Israelite spies reporting, "We saw the Nephilim there. We seemed like grasshoppers in our own eyes, and we looked the same to them." If this was mere metaphor, it was a potent one, so potent that it has been read for centuries as literal testimony. The search for physical evidence has not stopped. Modern-day explorers like Jim Vieira, Hugh Newman, and Michael Tellinger have cataloged hundreds of historical giant reports, pushing for renewed excavation of certain sites. In South Africa, Tellinger points to stone circles and massive footprints impressed in granite as potential signs of a pre-human civilization of great size. Critics dismiss these as geological curiosities, but to believers, they are hints, breadcrumbs along the trail of the Nephilim. The anthropological debate over giant remains ultimately comes down to verification. Without bodies that can be measured, tested, and peer-reviewed, the claims will remain in the shadowy realm between possibility and legend. But in that shadow, the Nephilim remain alive, less as proven beings and more as a persistent question. Did humanity once share this planet with a race of giants whose bodies now lie hidden or destroyed? From here, our journey will leave the ground beneath our feet and turn upward, to the stars. In the next part, we'll examine how ancient astronomical alignments, encoded in temples and megaliths, might connect the Nephilim to a cosmic origin story, and why so many ancient structures seem to look not just at the horizon, but far beyond it. Long before telescopes swept the heavens, humanity studied the night sky with a devotion that seems almost otherworldly. Across continents and millennia, ancient builders aligned their temples, pyramids, and megaliths with precision to celestial events, solstices, equinoxes, the risings of certain stars. The question is why? For some, these alignments were practical, guiding agricultural calendars. For others, they were sacred, tying Earth to the movements of the cosmos. But within the framework of the Nephilim story, they take on an additional, provocative possibility. That these alignments were inherited knowledge, passed down from beings whose connection to the heavens was not merely symbolic, but literal. Consider Göbekli Tepe in modern-day Turkey. At over 11,000 years old, this site predates Stonehenge by 6 millennia. Its massive T-shaped pillars, carved with animals and abstract symbols, are arranged in circles that some researchers believe mirror star patterns. In 2017, a study proposed that one carving may represent a comet strike linked to the Younger Dryas period, a global climatic upheaval. If true, Göbekli Tepe might be more than a temple. It could be a record of cosmic events observed by a culture with astonishing astronomical awareness. Where did they acquire such knowledge? Mainstream archaeology says it was the product of careful skywatching over generations. Alternative theorists suggest a more direct transmission from those who had already mapped the heavens. In Egypt, the 3 pyramids of Giza align with the 3 stars of Orion's belt. This alignment is not perfect, but close enough to suggest intent. The ancient Egyptians associated Orion with Osiris, the god of the afterlife, and with a celestial realm where the soul might travel. For those who see the Nephilim as sons of God, with origins beyond Earth, Orion's belt becomes more than a mythic symbol. It becomes a navigational marker, a celestial home port encoded in stone. The same pattern appears in the Americas. At Teotihuacan, in central Mexico, the layout of the city, its Avenue of the Dead, the pyramids of the sun and moon, aligns with key astronomical events. Some structures are oriented to the setting of the Pleiades, a star cluster revered in many cultures. The Maya built observatories like El Caracol at Chichen Itza, whose windows track the motions of Venus with extraordinary accuracy. In the Popol Vuh, Venus is linked to a divine hero. Could this shared reverence for certain stars and planets be coincidence, or was it part of a legacy left by beings who knew the sky as travelers, not just observers? Stonehenge in England and Newgrange in Ireland also join this chorus of cosmic architecture. Both are aligned to capture the sun's light during solstices. Newgrange with a beam that pierces its inner chamber at sunrise on the winter solstice, illuminating carvings older than the pyramids. Such precision required deep knowledge of solar movement and long-term observation. In the Nephilim narrative, such knowledge could have been seeded by their watchers, a fitting title for beings who not only observed humanity, but the heavens themselves. In the Levant, where the biblical story of the Nephilim unfolds, Mount Hermon looms large. According to the Book of Enoch, it was here that the Watchers descended. Interestingly, ancient dolmens dot the slopes and valleys around Mount Hermon. Megalithic stone structures whose purposes remain uncertain. Some researchers have noted that certain dolmens in the Golan Heights region align with solstices or with prominent stars. Could these have served as markers or beacons for a culture in close dialogue with the night sky? Astronomy's role in the Nephilim hypothesis becomes even more intriguing when we consider the recurrence of Orion, Sirius, and the Pleiades in mythologies worldwide. The Dogon people of Mali, for example, have long held oral traditions about the Sirius system, including details of Sirius B, a white dwarf companion star invisible to the naked eye. Their knowledge, recorded by French anthropologists in the 20th century, has been the subject of fierce debate. Some argue it was a modern contamination of older traditions. Others see it as evidence of ancient contact. If the Nephilim, or their counterparts in other cultures, had origins among the stars, such astronomical precision might be one of the few enduring traces of their presence. The practical and the sacred often overlap in these ancient alignments. For agricultural societies, knowing when to plant and harvest could mean survival. For temple priests, aligning a sanctuary with the sunrise on a holy day reinforced the connection between the divine and the natural order. But if the Nephilim brought advanced knowledge, they may have given early humans a cosmic framework that transcended immediate needs, a sense of belonging to a larger, inhabited universe. In the Book of Enoch, the Watchers are accused of teaching humanity the signs of the sun and moon and stars. This is often read as astrology, a forbidden mingling of the sacred and the profane. Yet in a different light, it could be a fragmentary memory of being taught actual celestial mechanics, orbital cycles, stellar navigation, even the concept of other worlds. If these beings were travelers, mapping the skies might have been as essential to them as mapping rivers and mountains is to us. The integration of sky knowledge into monumental architecture ensured that even as civilizations fell, the information remained, encoded in stone, immune to fire and flood. A future observer could stand at a particular point on a particular day and watch the sun or a star rise exactly where the builders intended. In this way, the Nephilim, if they existed, could leave a permanent signature, one that transcends language and survives the erasure of time. Skeptics argue that human cultures were fully capable of developing such astronomical skill on their own, without alien intervention or supernatural guidance. And they are right. There is no need to invoke the Nephilim to explain the alignment of Stonehenge or the Maya's Venus tables. But the persistence of these alignments across unconnected cultures invites deeper questions. Why do the same stars, Orion, Sirius, the Pleiades, appear again and again as focal points? Why does humanity's oldest architecture so often point upward, as if in homage to a connection we can no longer name? Whether the Nephilim were the original astronomers, the first sky mappers, or simply a mythic way of personifying the heavens, their story cannot be separated from the night sky. In the ancient world, the stars were not just lights, they were destinations, origins, and omens. The Nephilim's legacy, real or imagined, may still shine above us every night, waiting for someone to remember the path. In our next step, we will return to the floodwaters that erased much of the Nephilim's world. We will explore how the biblical deluge and its parallels in Mesopotamian and global flood myths may have marked not just the end of an age, but the deliberate cleansing of a world that had been altered beyond recognition. In the ancient texts, the world before the flood feels like a different planet, teeming with life, yes, but also shadowed by powers and beings that no longer walk among us. The Nephilim are a central part of that pre-flood world, described in Genesis as present in those days, and also afterward, their existence entangled with the rise of violence and corruption across the earth. And then, in a sudden, shattering act, the story turns. The Lord saw how great the wickedness of the human race had become on the earth. The Lord regretted that he had made human beings on the earth, and his heart was deeply troubled. Genesis 6:5-6. Within a few verses, the decision is made. A deluge will come, not a local flood, but one that erases nearly everything living, wiping clean the slate of creation. For the biblical writers, this is divine judgment. For those reading the story through the lens of the Nephilim, it is also a targeted strike, a way of eradicating a hybrid race that had crossed a boundary never meant to be crossed. The Book of Enoch makes this connection explicit. The archangels are given specific instructions. Bind the watchers in the depths, destroy their offspring in a great slaughter, and let the floodwaters finish what the swords began. The Nephilim, in this telling, are not merely collateral damage. They are one of the primary reasons for the flood itself. Their violence had filled the earth with blood, and their knowledge had accelerated humanity's descent into chaos. In Mesopotamia, the oldest flood stories echo this theme of a world altered beyond repair. In the Atrahasis epic, the gods decide to send a flood because humans have become too numerous and noisy, disturbing the divine order. But beneath the surface of the text is a recurring problem. The mingling of divine and mortal spheres, the transfer of forbidden skills, the destabilizing of creation's balance. The Sumerian king list records reigns of kings before the flood, lasting thousands of years. lifespans that shrink dramatically in the post-flood era, as if the reset also curtailed something in human longevity or ability. The Epic of Gilgamesh offers perhaps the most famous Mesopotamian parallel to Noah's Ark. Utnapishtim, warned by the god Ea, builds a massive boat to survive a flood sent by the assembly of gods. Gilgamesh himself, part divine and part human, lives in the shadow of that catastrophe, seeking immortality in a world where the old ways are gone. In both the biblical and Mesopotamian accounts, the flood is not only a physical event, but a rupture in history. A before and after that can never be undone. Flood myths are not confined to the Near East. Across the globe, from the highlands of Peru to the islands of the Pacific, indigenous traditions tell of a time when waters covered the earth, sparing only a few survivors. In many of these stories, the pre-flood world is populated by giants, heroes, or semi-divine beings who vanish in the cataclysm. In some, the survivors are warned by sky beings or animals. In others, the flood comes without warning, erasing entire races in a single tide. Geology offers its own whispers of catastrophe. Around 12,800 years ago, the Younger Dryas period began abruptly, a rapid cooling event that some scientists link to a comet impact or massive meltwater release. This shift coincided with the extinction of many large animal species and upheavals in human settlement patterns. For those who seek a historical kernel within the flood myths, such events offer a plausible backdrop. A real, devastating flood remembered and mythologized by countless cultures. In the Nephilim narrative, the flood is more than just disaster. It is cleansing. Whether one reads it through theology, myth, or alternative history, the intent is the same: to remove the influence of beings who were not meant to endure. But here the mystery deepens, because the Bible's own account, in Numbers 13, suggests that the Nephilim, or their descendants, somehow survived. The Israelite spies report seeing them in Canaan, long after the waters had receded. How could that be? Some suggest the phrase, "and also afterward," in Genesis 6, is a clue that not all Nephilim perished, or that the Watchers repeated their rebellion after the flood. Others argue that the later giants were unrelated tribes, remembered and labeled as Nephilim because of their size and ferocity. In either case, the persistence of giant figures in post-flood narratives suggests that the cataclysm, while devastating, did not completely erase their memory or their bloodline. The flood also reshapes the human world in subtle ways. In post-flood genealogies, lifespans shorten dramatically, technologies reset, and human society begins again from a smaller, more controlled population. For those who see the Nephilim as the product of genetic engineering or extraterrestrial interference, this could represent a deliberate reboot, removing the contamination of hybrid genes, or at least diluting them. Symbolically, the flood functions as a cosmic quarantine. The waters are the barrier that washes away a sickness from the body of the world. Yet the survival of certain myths, and perhaps certain individuals, hints at the impossibility of total erasure. Memories of the pre-flood world continue to ripple through time, carried in oral tradition, carved in stone, and written in the margins of sacred texts. At the human level, the flood story is also about loss. Entire civilizations vanish, along with their knowledge, their monuments, and their ways of life. In this sense, the Nephilim are not only villains, they are part of a vanished age, remembered with the same mix of fear and fascination we reserve for dinosaurs or ancient empires, whether one sees them as oppressors or as tragic casualties of divine justice. Their disappearance marks the end of a chapter that will never be repeated. Some modern interpreters take the flood narrative as a warning for our own time. The mingling of human and non-human DNA, once the realm of myth, is now a technical possibility through genetic engineering. The rapid rise of advanced technology in the hands of a still violent species recalls the ancient charge against the Watchers. The flood, in this view, is not only a record of what happened, but a cautionary tale about what could happen again. But perhaps the most haunting aspect of the flood story is its silence. We are told of the destruction, the ark, the survival of Noah's family, but the voices of the Nephilim themselves are absent. No lament, no defense, no final words. They vanish from the stage without speaking, leaving only the echoes of their presence in the world they left behind. When the waters recede, the earth is new again. The giants are gone, or almost gone. Humanity begins its second act, walking under the same stars that once shone on a different order of beings. The flood has done its work, but the memory of what it washed away will not be forgotten. In the next part, we will turn to the stories of power and technology attributed to the Nephilim, tales of weapons, tools, and abilities that, if real, could have given them dominance over early humanity. Whether these are mythic exaggerations or hints of lost science, they remain some of the most compelling fragments in the entire legend. In the scattered pages of ancient texts and the ruins left behind in stone, the Nephilim are remembered not only for their size, but for their abilities, their strength, their skill, and in some accounts, their possession of tools and weapons beyond the capacity of ordinary humans. Whether these powers were purely physical or also technological depends on how one reads the evidence, but either way, they set the Nephilim apart as rulers in a world still finding its shape. The Book of Enoch describes the Watchers, the progenitors of the Nephilim, as bearers of forbidden knowledge. Azazel teaches humans to forge swords, knives, and shields, to work with metals for war. Other Watchers instruct in the making of jewelry and cosmetics, in the enchantments of root-cutting and spellcraft. At first glance, these might seem like the ordinary advancements of a Bronze Age culture, but in the Enochian account, they arrive all at once, taught by beings who came from the heavens. To a pre-industrial people, the sudden mastery of metallurgy or chemical compounds could have felt like magic. Weapons appear repeatedly in the legends. The Nephilim are said to wield massive spears and blades, weapons proportionate to their size, capable of striking fear into entire armies. In Numbers 13, the Israelite spies do not merely describe the descendants of the Nephilim as tall. They describe themselves as grasshoppers by comparison, implying an imbalance not just in stature, but in battle capability. Later traditions in Jewish Midrash speak of Og, king of Bashan, as the last of the giants, with an iron bed over 13 feet long. If this was truly his bed, or a sarcophagus, it would be an artifact of imposing scale. Archaeological finds sometimes seem to echo these descriptions. Oversized stone axes, hammers, and grinding tools have been unearthed in various parts of the world. Mainstream archaeology usually interprets them as ceremonial, symbolic, or designed for multiple hands to use together. But to those following the Nephilim trail, they could be remnants of a people for whom such sizes were practical. At Baalbek, the colossal stone blocks in the Temple of Jupiter platform suggest not only immense labor power, but tools and engineering methods that remain unexplained. Were such feats achieved solely with ropes, levers, and manpower? Or was there knowledge of lifting and cutting techniques that has since been lost? Some accounts push even further into the realm of technological mystery. In Mesopotamian iconography, gods and kings are sometimes depicted holding what researchers call the bag motif, a small rectangular object with a handle carried in a way that suggests it was important. These bags appear in Sumerian carvings, at Göbekli Tepe, and in Mesoamerican reliefs spanning thousands of miles and years. To conventional archaeology, these are symbolic items, perhaps seed bags or ritual containers. But in the speculative view, they are portable devices, tools of unknown function, carried by the same kind of beings later remembered as Nephilim. Legends from other cultures also describe giant or divine beings with mastery over forces beyond human comprehension. In the Hindu Mahabharata, heroes of semi-divine descent wield weapons like the Brahmastra, a missile capable of immense destruction, reminiscent of modern nuclear descriptions. In Greek myth, the Gigantes battle the Olympians with weapons forged in the depths of the earth. These parallels may be coincidence, the natural flowering of human imagination, but they also feed into the theory that an ancient technological age was buried by the flood, leaving only myth as its record. The control of the natural world is another theme. In Enoch, the Watchers teach the signs of the clouds and the course of the moon, which could be read as meteorology and astronomy. In agriculture, ancient Mesopotamian texts describe irrigation systems and crop management with a level of sophistication that surprises many historians. If the Nephilim were part of this picture, they may have acted as both warriors and engineers, imposing their dominance through a combination of physical power and infrastructural mastery. There are also more esoteric claims, accounts of levitation, anti-gravity, or sonic technology. While these ideas have no direct textual basis, they emerge from attempts to explain how megalithic structures were built without cranes, pulleys, or steel tools. Researchers like Christopher Dunn have argued that certain Egyptian artifacts, such as the precision-cut granite boxes at Saqqara, may have been made with advanced machining techniques. If true, such methods would require a technological base far beyond what we attribute to ancient civilizations. In the Nephilim hypothesis, such precision could be the work of hybrid beings who brought tools and techniques from elsewhere. Even in death, the Nephilim are said to have retained an aura of power. In later Jewish and Christian demonology, the spirits of the giants, disembodied after their destruction in the flood, become the unclean spirits that haunt the world, influencing human affairs. This belief, rooted in Enoch, casts the Nephilim not only as figures of physical domination, but as entities whose influence persisted in the unseen realm, shaping cultures long after their bodies turned to dust. It is possible to read all of this through a purely human lens. Large warriors and tribal chieftains, armed with the latest metallurgical advancements, could dominate smaller, less advanced communities. Over time, the stories of these powerful humans could be magnified into the legends of giants with superhuman abilities. The technology could be nothing more than the leading edge of human innovation in its time. But the consistency of certain themes, the sudden arrival of advanced skills, The emphasis on size and strength, the building of impossibly large structures, the possession of mysterious portable objects, keeps the door open for a different interpretation. If the Nephilim were hybrids, or even entirely non-human in origin, their technological superiority could have been as natural to them as tool-making is to us. In such a case, the boundary between magic and machinery would blur, and the ancient chroniclers, lacking our vocabulary, would describe it in the only terms they knew, as the gifts or curses of gods. What is certain is that in the memory of ancient peoples, the Nephilim were not ordinary. Whether they were the tyrants of early humanity or its reluctant teachers, they left behind traces, literal or imagined, of a power that could build empires, topple cities, and alter the course of civilization. From here, our journey will turn to the ground beneath our feet again, but with a different focus, the Earth's own story. In the next part, we will examine geological evidence for cataclysms that might have erased the Nephilim's world, events that left marks not only in myth, but in the very bones of the planet. If the Nephilim once ruled the Earth, whether as towering warriors, hybrid beings, or simply as the most formidable humans of their time, then something must have brought their age to an end. Ancient texts tell us the flood was the instrument of their destruction, but geology offers its own version of that story, a record written in stone, ice, and sediment. And in that record, we find signs of upheaval so vast they could have swept away entire civilizations. Around 12,800 years ago, something happened. This is the start of the Younger Dryas period, a sudden and dramatic cooling that lasted over 1,000 years. Ice core samples from Greenland reveal an abrupt drop in temperature, possibly within a single season. Across North America and Europe, plant and animal species vanished, including mammoths, mastodons, and saber-toothed cats. Human cultures were disrupted. Settlements vanished. This was no slow climate drift. It was a shock. One hypothesis is that a massive influx of meltwater from retreating glaciers flooded into the oceans, disrupting global currents and plunging the planet back into near glacial conditions. Another, more controversial, is the Younger Dryas impact hypothesis, that a fragmented comet or asteroid struck the ice sheets, triggering wildfires, atmospheric dust, and massive flooding. Proponents of this theory point to layers of black sediment rich in microspherules, nanodiamonds, and iridium, materials associated with cosmic impacts, found at sites across 4 continents. For those who see the Nephilim as real historical beings, the timing is suggestive. If they flourished in the world before this event, such a cataclysm could have been the physical counterpart to the biblical and Mesopotamian flood myths. The heat of impact, followed by torrents of meltwater and global climate chaos, would have erased cities, fields, and monuments, leaving only the most durable megaliths as witnesses. Geology also offers evidence for catastrophic flooding beyond the Younger Dryas. In the Pacific Northwest of North America, the scablands of eastern Washington bear scars from the Missoula floods, massive outbursts of glacial meltwater that swept across the land at speeds up to 80 miles per hour. These floods carved canyons, moved boulders the size of houses, and left behind ripple marks hundreds of feet long. Though these floods are dated to around 15,000 years ago and attributed to natural glacial processes, they give us a glimpse of what world-ending water can do. In the Near East, the region where the biblical flood narrative likely emerged, Geological studies show evidence of sudden flooding in the Mesopotamian basin. Sediment layers at sites like Ur and Shuruppak indicate rapid deposits of waterborne silt over ancient habitation layers, possible traces of regional floods that may have inspired or been incorporated into the broader mythic tradition. While these were not global events, to the people living there, they would have felt like the end of the world. Volcanic activity, too, has left its mark on ancient memory. The eruption of Thera, Santorini, around 1600 BCE devastated the Minoan civilization and sent shockwaves, both literal and cultural, across the Mediterranean. If similar eruptions occurred in the deeper past, their tsunamis, ash clouds, and agricultural collapse could have erased entire societies. For a people like the Nephilim, whose power may have depended on organized agriculture and monumental centers, such destruction would have been as lethal as any divine judgment. Sea level rise after the last ice age transformed coastlines and drowned vast tracts of land. In Southeast Asia, the Sunda Shelf was once a continuous expanse connecting modern-day Indonesia, Malaysia, and the Philippines. As the seas rose, this land disappeared beneath the waves, forcing mass migrations and erasing coastal settlements. Off the coast of India, the submerged city of Dwarka, dated by some to over 9,000 years ago, suggests that human habitation once extended into areas now claimed by the ocean. In the Nephilim framework, such lost coastlines could hide the ruins of their strongholds, preserved only in submerged archaeology and oral tradition. The connection between geological disaster and myth is not speculative, it's observable. The Native American stories of the Missoula floods, the Pacific Islander legends of swallowed islands, and the Norse tale of Ragnarok's world-encircling flood all likely encode memories of real environmental trauma. If the Nephilim lived in an age of greater geological volatility, then the destruction of their world would have been recorded not only in sediment layers, but in the collective human psyche. From a symbolic perspective, the biblical flood and its global parallels could be read as the human mind's way of grappling with the sheer scale of natural disaster. From a historical perspective, they could be the oral history of real, rapid events. And from the viewpoint of the Nephilim hypothesis, they could be the chronicle of a deliberate reset, whether orchestrated by divine will or by the very beings who once shaped early human history. There is another geological thread worth noting: the shift in Earth's climate and ecosystems after these catastrophes. In the post-flood world, many large animal species were gone. Forests had been replaced by grasslands, and the human population was smaller and more scattered. This would have been a hostile environment for any beings adapted to the lush, resource-rich pre-cataclysm world. If the Nephilim required abundant food and centralized infrastructure, the collapse of those systems would have doomed them. Some researchers speculate that the very size attributed to the Nephilim would have been their undoing in such an environment. Larger bodies require more calories, more water, and more shelter. In a world recovering from disaster, where resources were scarce and weather unpredictable, such giants, whether literal or metaphorical, would be at a severe disadvantage. In the alternative history view, it is tempting to imagine remnants of Nephilim civilization surviving in isolated pockets, mountain fortresses, hidden valleys, or islands spared by the worst of the floods. Over generations, these survivors could have dwindled in number, their knowledge fading, their stature decreasing through interbreeding with smaller human populations until only memory remained. This could explain the "and also afterward" of Genesis 6:4, faint echoes of giants still seen in later eras. Whether one interprets the evidence through the lens of plate tectonics and glacial melt, or through the lens of myth and legend, the conclusion is the same. The earth has not been a gentle home. It has turned against its inhabitants more than once, reshaping the map and wiping entire ways of life from existence. For the Nephilim, whatever their true nature, the geological record may be the silent testimony to their fall. In the absence of written records from their own hand, we are left to read the rocks, the ice, and the silt for signs of a vanished world, a world where titans may have walked, until the earth itself rose to erase them. In the next chapter of our journey, we will turn from the stones of the earth to the symbols of the mind, examining how ancient religious iconography, sacred art, and cryptic symbols may conceal references to the Nephilim, preserved not in ruins, but in the visual language of faith. When a story is too dangerous to tell directly, it often survives in symbols. Across the ancient world, the memory of the Nephilim, whether real beings or mythic archetypes, may not have been preserved in long, explicit texts, but in art, sacred geometry, and cryptic iconography woven into the fabric of religion. These symbols speak in a language that can bypass censorship, cross cultural boundaries, and outlive empires. In the ancient Near East, human-animal hybrids are a recurring motif. Winged bulls with human heads, Lamassu, guard the gates of Assyrian palaces. The towering figures are both protectors and warnings, embodiments of power that straddles two realms. To a modern viewer, they are art. To the people of Nineveh, they were a visual theology, a reminder that beings of immense power had once walked the earth. In the Nephilim hypothesis, such images could be stylized portraits of hybrid entities, the same kind of cross-blood creatures described in Genesis 6 and the Book of Enoch. Egyptian temple art likewise preserves beings who are part human, part divine, often with exaggerated scale compared to mortal figures. Pharaohs are depicted towering over enemies, sometimes many times their size, in a way that goes beyond symbolic dominance. While most scholars see this as political propaganda, alternative interpreters ask whether these depictions echo an older memory of rulers who were physically larger, perhaps descendants of a giant lineage. The crowns, staffs, and headdresses they wear, often elongated or horned, become part of a visual vocabulary that recurs in other cultures' depictions of sky gods or fallen ones. In the Levant, the biblical heartland, iconography is subtler but still present. Ancient Israel's aniconic tradition, its reluctance to depict divine figures, means that overt images of the Nephilim are absent. Yet Canaanite and Phoenician art, from which Israelite culture partly emerged, features tall warrior gods with horned helmets and weapons of disproportionate size. These gods stand beside smaller human worshippers, their scale alone marking them as other. The same horned helmet motif appears in Mesopotamian art as a symbol of divinity. Perhaps not literal horns, but a stylized crown that signaled celestial origin. The horn motif is one of the most persistent across cultures. In the ancient world, horns symbolized strength, rulership, and connection to the divine realm. The biblical description of Og, king of Bashan, a figure linked by tradition to the Rephaim, possible post-flood descendants of the Nephilim, places him in a region where horned deity statues were common. If Og's story has roots in historical reality, the art of his time could have preserved a stylized memory of his people's form. Sacred geometry also plays a role. Many ancient temples and monuments are constructed according to mathematical ratios that appear in nature. The golden ratio, the Pythagorean triangle, and astronomical alignments. In the alternative history view, such precision might have been part of the Nephilim's legacy, a way of embedding their knowledge into structures that would endure long after their disappearance. The geometric patterns themselves, seen in floor mosaics, temple layouts, and even the proportions of sacred vessels, could be read as a coded language passed down through priesthoods. Consider the recurring image of the Tree of Life in Mesopotamian art. Flanked by two winged beings, often with human faces, this tree has branches stylized into symmetrical patterns, sometimes topped with rosettes or stars. Mainstream scholars see it as a fertility symbol or a representation of the axis mundi, the world's spiritual center. In the Nephilim narrative, it might represent genetic knowledge, the branches symbolizing the mingling of bloodlines between divine and human. The winged beings could be the watchers themselves, guarding or manipulating this sacred inheritance. In Mesoamerica, sacred iconography also suggests beings of unusual stature or origin. Mayan stelae show rulers wearing elaborate headdresses that make them appear unnaturally tall, standing beside attendants depicted at a much smaller scale. Some carry objects resembling modern-day breathing apparatus or tools. While these are conventionally interpreted as ceremonial gear, the alternative reading is that these rulers were modeled on, or were themselves, descendants of sky beings akin to the Nephilim. Christian art, centuries later, would inherit and transform some of these motifs. Medieval manuscripts sometimes depict biblical giants, like those of Numbers 13, as towering above normal soldiers, armed with immense weapons. Illuminated capitals in monastic Bibles show hybrids with distorted faces and animal traits, echoing the older Near Eastern visual language of beings who did not fit into the normal human mold. While often treated as purely allegorical, such images may have been inspired by older pre-Christian traditions about hybrid beings. Perhaps the most intriguing symbols are those that appear globally without direct cultural contact. The halo, or radiant crown, surrounding the heads of deities, saints, or rulers appears in Mesopotamian, Egyptian, Greek, Buddhist, and Christian art. The Nephilim hypothesis suggests this may be a stylized memory of actual light or energy associated with these beings, whether from advanced technology, natural physiology, or simply the awe they inspired. To ancient artists, the easiest way to depict such an aura was to draw it as a circle or rays of light. The problem for researchers is that iconography is fluid. The same symbol can mean different things in different contexts, and over centuries, meanings shift. A horned crown that once signified descended from the heavens could, in later times, mean simply king. A depiction of exaggerated size might start as a literal portrayal of a giant, and later become an artistic convention for importance. This is where the line between history and art becomes hardest to trace. Yet when these symbols are taken together, human-animal hybrids, exaggerated scale, horned crowns, radiant auras, sacred geometry, They form a visual fingerprint that shows up again and again in cultures connected only distantly, if at all. If the Nephilim existed, these could be the surviving portraits of their kind, encoded in religious art so that even after their names were forgotten, their image would endure. It's possible that this was deliberate. If the Nephilim held power over ancient societies, they might have ensured their likeness was woven into the sacred architecture and imagery, knowing that priests, kings, and artists would preserve it for generations. In this sense, the temples, statues, and carvings that survive today could be the last silent testimony of a people erased by both catastrophe and design. From here, our path will shift from art to narrative once more. In the next part, we will explore why the Nephilim nearly vanish from the official canon of Scripture, and how historical decisions, political pressures, and theological priorities may have conspired to bury their story. The Nephilim appear in only 2 places in the standard Protestant Bible, Genesis 6 or 1-4 and Numbers 13:33. In the former, they arrive without introduction, framed in a cryptic account of divine beings and human women. In the latter, they are a fearful memory invoked by Israelite spies to describe the inhabitants of Canaan. Between those 2 moments lies silence, centuries of biblical history in which their name does not surface at all. It is as though the text deliberately pulls a curtain over them. Why would such a potent image, giants born of divine human unions, destroyed in the flood yet somehow reappearing, be given so little space? One explanation is theological. The Hebrew Bible's central message is the relationship between Israel and its God. To dwell on the Nephilim would be to risk drawing attention away from that covenantal story toward a dangerous fascination with supernatural beings. By compressing their account into a few enigmatic verses, the authors ensured the Nephilim remained peripheral, not central. Another factor is the polemic nature of Israelite religion. The surrounding cultures of Canaan, Mesopotamia, and Egypt celebrated their divine human heroes, Gilgamesh, Hercules-like warriors, semi-divine kings, often as ideals. The Genesis account, by contrast, reframes such figures not as noble but as corrupt, part of the problem that required God's judgment. By minimizing details, the writers stripped the glamour from the archetype. The Nephilim are neither glorified nor given a stage to inspire imitation, but the brevity may also be the result of editorial choice during the compilation of the Hebrew Bible. Ancient Israel's scriptures were not static. They evolved through oral tradition, early written forms, and later redaction. In the process, certain stories may have been shortened or excluded. The Book of Enoch, Jubilees, and the Book of Giants, which expand the Nephilim narrative, were widely read among Second Temple Jewish communities. The Dead Sea Scrolls show that these works were preserved alongside canonical texts. Yet when the Jewish canon was solidified, these writings were left outside, labeled as non-authoritative. The early Christian church inherited this selective silence. While some church fathers, like Tertullian, considered Enoch to be inspired, the majority eventually set it aside. Augustine of Hippo, one of the most influential theologians in Western Christianity, rejected the supernatural interpretation of Genesis 6, arguing instead that sons of God referred to the godly line of Seth and daughters of men to the ungodly line of Cain. This Sethite view effectively erased the idea of angelic human hybrids, recasting the Nephilim as ordinary humans of great stature or reputation. Augustine's interpretation fit neatly into the theological framework of the Church. It avoided speculation about angelic sexuality, which raised uncomfortable questions about the nature of spiritual beings, and it aligned with the broader Christian effort to distance itself from what might be seen as pagan myth. Over time, this interpretation became dominant in the West, shaping translations, commentaries, and sermons for over 1,000 years. The Council of Nicaea in 325 CE did not directly address the Nephilim, but the drive for doctrinal unity in that period had a similar effect. Stories that could encourage heterodox beliefs or folk speculation were minimized. The goal was a stable, orthodox canon and interpretation, not an open field for cosmological debate. Even in the Eastern Christian tradition, where Enoch remained part of the Ethiopian Orthodox canon, the focus was rarely on the giants themselves. Preachers emphasized the moral lessons, the dangers of corruption, the need for divine judgment, rather than the nature of the beings destroyed in the flood. One could also argue that the Nephilim disappeared from Scripture's spotlight because they belonged to a pre-flood world, a world that the biblical narrative itself treats as alien and unrecoverable. Once the flood is over, the Bible's attention shifts to the new covenant with Noah, then to Abraham, and onward toward the history of Israel. The Nephilim become a relic of those days, deliberately fenced off from the present age, and yet their ghost remains. The brief mention in Numbers 13 during the reconnaissance of Canaan is striking. The spies describe seeing the Anakim, descendants of the Nephilim, and report feeling like grasshoppers in comparison. Whether this was hyperbole born of fear or a literal description, it shows that the memory of the Nephilim endured centuries after the flood narrative. Even if the giants no longer walked among the people, the idea of them still held power. For those who favor the historical or extraterrestrial interpretation of the Nephilim, this silence is suspicious. If such beings truly existed, then erasing their story from official scripture could be seen as an act of suppression, whether by ancient editors seeking theological purity or later authorities wishing to avoid questions about humanity's origins. In this view, the apocryphal and pseudepigraphal writings are the scraps that escaped the editorial blade, preserving a more complete picture of the pre-flood world. The alternative, of course, is that the silence reflects the story's status as myth from the start, a narrative adapted from older Near Eastern tales, briefly included to make a theological point, then allowed to fade when it no longer served the central message. In that case, the absence of detail is simply evidence of narrative economy, not deliberate censorship. Either way, the result is the same. The Nephilim are left as an open question. The few biblical lines about them act like the edges of a torn page. We can see the outline of a larger story, but the center is missing. That absence has fueled centuries of speculation, from medieval demonology to modern ancient astronaut theories. And perhaps this is the enduring power of the Nephilim in Scripture. Not in what is said, but in what is not. The silence is an invitation to look elsewhere, to archaeology, to comparative mythology, to the forbidden books once read by desert sects and early believers. In that silence, the Nephilim have become whatever the seeker needs them to be, symbols of rebellion, warnings from the past, or evidence of a hidden chapter in human history. In the next stage of our journey, we will turn to the voices that refused to let the Nephilim go quiet, the folk traditions and local legends from around the world that keep the memory of giants alive long after the official texts turned away. When the official scriptures fall silent, the people keep talking. Across continents, long after the Nephilim vanished from the canon, folk traditions carried their echoes. These are not the carefully edited verses of a religious text, but the living, shifting stories told around fires, in marketplaces, and from parent to child. In these tales, giants walk freely, sometimes as heroes, sometimes as monsters, always as beings set apart from ordinary humanity. In the Celtic traditions of the British Isles, giants are builders, warriors, and occasional villains. The Giant's Causeway in Northern Ireland is said to have been built by Fionn mac Cumhoil, a warrior so large he could stride across seas. In Cornwall, the giant Cormoran is remembered for stealing cattle until slain by a clever youth. While these tales are now told as fantasy, archaeologists note that many megalithic structures in the British Isles, stone circles, standing stones, dolmens, are linked in local lore to giant builders. This parallels biblical and Near Eastern traditions that ascribe great works to Nephilim or their descendants. In Norse mythology, the Jötnar, often translated as giants, are primordial beings who predate the gods themselves. They are not always physically massive, but they embody forces of chaos, nature, and ancient knowledge. The gods of Asgard intermarry with them, producing hybrid offspring, an echo of the Genesis theme of divine-human unions. When Ragnarok comes, the giants rise against the gods, a final cosmic battle not unlike the destruction of the Nephilim in the flood. African traditions preserve their own giant lore. Among the Zulu, there are stories of people so tall they could step over rivers, who lived in the mountains before the arrival of ordinary humans. In West Africa, the Dama people speak of powerful first people who built vast stone structures and were later driven away or destroyed. Some researchers have noted the striking similarity between these accounts and those from the Middle East, where the Rephaim, linked to the Nephilim, are associated with ancient stone tombs and fortresses. In the Americas, native traditions frequently speak of giants. The Paiute of Nevada tell of the Siteka, red-haired giants who lived in the region's caves and were enemies of the tribe. According to legend, the Paiute eventually trapped the Siteka in Lovelock Cave and set it ablaze. Excavations in the early 20th century did yield artifacts and mummified remains, though not confirmed as giants, fueling speculation about the story's origins. The Choctaw recount tales of the Nahulo, a race of huge, pale-skinned people who once roamed the land and were feared as cannibals. South America's Andean cultures speak of gentiles or gigantes, who lived before the Inca and built the massive stoneworks of Sacsayhuaman and Tiahuanaco. In some versions, these beings offended the gods and were turned to stone. In Patagonia, early European explorers like Antonio Pigafetta recorded indigenous accounts of extraordinarily tall people, which they relayed to European audiences as factual observations. These reports, later exaggerated, gave rise to the enduring myth of Patagonian giants. Polynesian legends often remember long people, or tall ones, who predate the current inhabitants. In Tonga and Samoa, ancient stone monuments are said to have been built by a race of powerful beings. In Hawaii, The Kanaka Nui are described as towering figures capable of great feats of construction and navigation. These stories often tie the giants to the sea, suggesting they were travelers or settlers from distant lands, perhaps recalling the same sky-descending motif found in the Nephilim myth. In Asia, the stories vary but persist. In Chinese legend, the figure of Kua Fu is a giant who chases the sun, striding across the land in pursuit of light. In Central Asia, nomadic traditions speak of bone mountains, where the remains of great warriors are buried. In parts of the Caucasus, old shrines claim to house the femurs of men taller than any alive today. Such bones often turn out to belong to animals, but the belief in their human origin shows how deeply the giant archetype is embedded in cultural memory. What is striking is not just the global distribution of giant lore, but the recurring themes. In many cultures, giants are remembered as builders of great works: stone platforms, megalithic tombs, cyclopean walls that current populations either cannot replicate or did not originally construct. They are often associated with violence or arrogance, provoking divine or human retaliation, and they frequently exist in a time before a flood, before the gods departed, before the current order of the world. For proponents of the Nephilim hypothesis, these parallels are not coincidence. They are seen as fractured pieces of a single ancient memory, scattered by migration and time. The details shift: red hair in Nevada, horned helmets in Canaan, sea travel in Polynesia. But the underlying pattern is constant: a race apart, greater in stature and skill, whose downfall is inevitable. Mainstream anthropology offers a simpler explanation. The giant figure is a near-universal mythic archetype, a way for human cultures to externalize the concept of power, danger, or the other. Megalithic works may inspire stories of superhuman builders simply because they dwarf ordinary human effort. Occasional encounters with very tall individuals, perhaps 7 or 8 feet, could seed exaggerated legends over generations. Yet the overlap between these folk traditions and the biblical description of the Nephilim is difficult to ignore. Both describe beings set apart from ordinary humans, often tied to a time before a great catastrophe, and frequently remembered as enemies of the current human order. Even the moral framing is similar. Giants are not merely large, they are disruptive, their power a threat to the balance of the world. In some cases, the folk traditions preserve details absent from the Bible, but present in extra-biblical texts like Enoch, such as cannibalism, war against humanity, and the possession of special knowledge. These echoes suggest either a shared source or the remarkable persistence of certain motifs across time and geography. Whether we treat them as history, myth, or something in between, these global giant traditions keep the Nephilim alive in the human imagination. They fill in the spaces left blank by Scripture, offering color, context, and character to beings the official texts chose to render as shadows. In the next part, we will narrow our focus again to the intriguing theory that some of history's royal bloodlines may trace their origins, at least in legend, to the Nephilim or their post-flood descendants. This is where giants step out of myth and into the politics of kingship. In ancient times, rulership was rarely justified by merit alone. Kingship demanded a claim to something greater: divine favor, supernatural ancestry, or bloodlines that set rulers apart from ordinary men. Across cultures, this claim often took the form of lineage traced to gods, giants, or semi-divine heroes. In the Nephilim narrative, such claims take on a darker possibility, that some ruling houses may have preserved, or at least believed they preserved, the blood of these ancient hybrids. Egypt offers one of the clearest examples. Pharaohs were not merely political leaders. They were gods on earth, the living embodiment of Horus, the son of Osiris. Reliefs and inscriptions often portray them at exaggerated scale compared to their subjects, not just as artistic convention, but as a statement of difference. In some depictions, the pharaoh towers over bound captives, his hand grasping them as if they were dolls. Mainstream Egyptology interprets this as symbolic of power, yet it mirrors artistic conventions in other cultures where rulers were literally remembered as larger than life. The concept of divine seed runs deep in Mesopotamia as well. The Sumerian king list, which records kingship stretching back thousands of years before the flood, begins with rulers whose reigns span centuries. Some of these kings are associated with the Anunnaki, the gods who descended from the heavens. In the alternative history view, these early rulers could have been the same beings the Bible calls Nephilim, hybrids with lifespans and abilities far beyond human norms, passing their traits to descendants who continued to rule after the flood. In the Levant, biblical figures like Og, king of Bashan, stand out as possible remnants of this legacy. Deuteronomy describes Og as the last of the Rephaim, a term linked to ancient giants. His bedstead of iron, over 13 feet in length, is either literal or a statement of his extraordinary size. Og's territory, in the Bashan region, was dotted with megalithic dolmens and stone structures, sites that some researchers connect to ancient giant lore. If Og's reign represented a surviving fragment of Nephilim influence, his defeat at the hands of Israel's armies would symbolize the final purging of that bloodline from the region. The idea of divine or giant ancestry in royal lines is not limited to the Near East. In the Mediterranean, Greek myths tell of heroes like Heracles, Achilles, and Perseus, sons of gods and mortal women, who go on to found dynasties. The Spartans traced their kingship to Heracles, whose legendary strength and size mark him as a figure in the Nephilim mold. Alexander the Great encouraged rumors that he was descended from Achilles, further linking his own conquests to a heroic, semi-divine past. In Europe's north, Norse sagas present kings and jarls claiming descent from the Jötnar, giants who intermarried with the gods. These lineages often emphasized traits like unusual height, strength, or battle prowess, suggesting that physical difference was part of the royal mystique. The early Irish kings were sometimes said to descend from the Fomorians, a race of giant beings who lived before the arrival of the current people. Even in the Americas, the divine bloodline motif surfaces. The Inca emperors claimed descent from Inti, the sun god, whose first children were said to emerge from Lake Titicaca. Some depictions show these founders as physically larger and more robust than their subjects. In Mesoamerica, certain Maya and Aztec rulers claimed kinship with sky gods or heroes who descended from the heavens, echoing the sons of God motif from Genesis. Why would so many ruling houses claim descent from beings outside the human norm? On one level, it is political theater, an assertion that the king's authority is ordained by forces beyond human challenge. But in the Nephilim framework, these claims may conceal a historical reality, that in the distant past, there were indeed rulers who were physically different, perhaps hybrids, whose bloodlines were carefully maintained through selective marriage. Selective marriage was common in ancient royal families. In Egypt, sibling marriage among pharaohs was intended to preserve divine blood. In the Inca Empire, emperors married their sisters to keep the son's blood pure. In Europe, dynastic intermarriage created tightly knit royal networks that preserved family traits for centuries. If a Nephilim bloodline existed, similar practices could have been used to preserve whatever made them distinct. Even in the Bible, hints of giant-linked rulers persist. The Anakim of Canaan, feared by the Israelite spies, were said to descend from the Nephilim. Joshua's campaigns drove them out of much of the land, but some survived in Gaza, Gath, and Ashdod. Generations later, Goliath of Gath, over 9 feet tall according to 1 Samuel, may represent a final echo of this warrior lineage. Goliath's size and martial skill fit the Nephilim archetype, and his defeat at the hands of David is framed as more than just a military victory. It is a symbolic triumph of the covenant people over the remnants of a rival, possibly corrupted, bloodline. In medieval and early modern Europe, certain noble families cultivated legends of giant ancestry. The Scottish clan Fraser claimed descent from a warrior of extraordinary size and strength. In Basque country, oral traditions spoke of the Gentilac, giants who built dolmens and were ancestors to some local families. These legends may have been embellishment, but they also reflect the enduring allure of a giant-linked origin. From the perspective of the Nephilim hypothesis, royal bloodlines are the most plausible avenue by which any genetic trace of these beings could survive. Giants living among ordinary humans would be conspicuous and vulnerable. Giants protected by wealth, power, and divine status could endure for generations. Over time, their physical distinctions might diminish through intermarriage with humans, but the prestige of their lineage could persist, guarded by tradition and ritual. Mainstream historians and geneticists see no evidence for a surviving non-human bloodline in royalty. Height variations, even extremes, can be explained through natural genetics and nutrition. The divine ancestry motif is understood as myth-making, a universal human strategy to legitimize political power. Yet even within this explanation lies a curious fact. So many cultures chose giants, semi-divine hybrids, or sky-descending beings as the cornerstone of their dynasties. If it was all invention, why the same invention everywhere? Whether symbolic or literal, the link between kingship and the Nephilim idea is one of continuity. It suggests that the memory of these beings, however transformed, remained embedded in the very structures of power long after their supposed disappearance. In thrones, crowns, and genealogies, the shadow of the Nephilim lingered, hidden in plain sight. In the next part, we will step into the modern era of scholarship and skepticism, examining how historians, archaeologists, and theologians have challenged the Nephilim narrative and what evidence they use to dismantle the claims we've followed so far. For centuries, the Nephilim have been magnets for speculation. In popular imagination, they are towering warriors, hybrid offspring of divine beings, or even extraterrestrial visitors. But within the halls of academia, the story takes a different shape. Here, historians, archaeologists, and theologians offer explanations that strip away the supernatural and frame the Nephilim as a product of literary tradition, cultural borrowing, and human imagination. The first line of rebuttal comes from theology itself. Most mainstream biblical scholars reject the idea that Genesis 6 describes angels physically mating with human women. Instead, they turn to the so-called Sethite interpretation, formalized by early theologians like Augustine. In this reading, the sons of God were the righteous descendants of Seth, Adam's third son, while the daughters of men were from the ungodly line of Cain. The union of these two lines symbolized moral corruption, not genetic hybridity. The Nephilim, then, were simply powerful or notorious humans, men of renown whose fame came from violence, not divine heritage. Supporters of this view argue that it fits the Bible's overarching theological message without invoking bizarre metaphysics. Angels, they note, are spiritual beings without physical bodies in traditional Jewish and Christian theology. The idea of them fathering children conflicts with passages like Matthew 22:30, which says angels neither marry nor are given in marriage. From this perspective, the hybrid giant interpretation is dismissed as a misreading or a borrowing from surrounding pagan myths. The second rebuttal comes from literary criticism. Scholars point out that the Nephilim passage in Genesis 6 is part of a larger pre-flood narrative filled with symbolic motifs, human wickedness, divine judgment, and a cosmic reset. The giants function as a narrative bridge between the growth of human sin and the catastrophic flood. Their role is less about historical biography and more about embodying the excess of that era, excess in size, power, and corruption. In this sense, the Nephilim are a literary device, not a historical record. Comparative mythology strengthens this view. Ancient Near Eastern literature is rich with stories of semi-divine heroes and giants, Gilgamesh in Mesopotamia, the Apkallu sages, and the mighty kings listed in the Sumerian king list. Scholars see Genesis 6 as an Israelite adaptation of these widespread motifs, repurposed to fit a monotheistic framework. The biblical authors, in this view, took familiar cultural images and redefined them under the sovereignty of one God, stripping them of their polytheistic glory and casting them as corrupt. Archaeology provides the third and perhaps most decisive line of rebuttal. Despite numerous claims of giant skeleton discoveries, no verified physical remains of humans over 8 to 9 feet tall have been documented in a scientifically rigorous, peer-reviewed context. The largest confirmed human skeletons, like that of Robert Wadlow, who stood 8 feet 11 inches, are explained by rare medical conditions such as gigantism, which comes with severe health complications and does not indicate a separate species. Many giant bones reported in the 19th and early 20th centuries turned out to be hoaxes, misidentified animal remains, or the result of exaggerated newspaper reporting during a period when sensationalism sold papers. The Smithsonian cover-up theory, popular in alternative history circles, is flatly denied by the institution, which maintains that no such remains exist in its archives. Without verifiable specimens, academic consensus remains firm. There is no physical evidence for a race of giants in the human past. Linguistics also weighs in. The Hebrew word Nephilim may derive from the root NPL, meaning to fall or fallen ones. This could refer to their moral state, fallen from righteousness, rather than their physical size. The Septuagint's translation of the word into Greek as gigantes, giants, may have skewed later interpretation. In classical Greek, gigantes doesn't always mean literal size. It can denote beings of great strength or rebellious nature. Scholars argue that this linguistic shift helped feed the popular image of towering beings when the original term may have carried a different nuance. From a historical critical perspective, the silence about the Nephilim in later biblical books is another argument against their literal existence. If they had been a real, physically distinct race, why do they vanish from the narrative after Numbers 13? The academic answer: because they were never meant to be part of ongoing history. They belonged to the mythic pre-flood era, a symbolic world deliberately separated from the historical timeline that follows. Skeptics also challenge the connection between the Nephilim and megalithic architecture. Mainstream archaeology attributes sites like Baalbek, Stonehenge, and Sacsayhuaman to the ingenuity of the human cultures that inhabited those regions, often with clear evidence of the tools and methods used. The argument that humans couldn't have built this is seen as underestimating ancient engineering skills and ignoring incremental innovation over centuries. The ancient astronaut hypothesis, which equates the Nephilim with extraterrestrial visitors, faces equally strong criticism. Historians argue that it projects modern science fiction ideas onto ancient texts, reading spacecraft into chariots of fire and genetic engineering into divine unions. Without tangible extraterrestrial artifacts, the theory remains speculative, resting on interpretation rather than hard evidence. For many scholars, the enduring fascination with the Nephilim says more about us than about the ancient world. In an age where boundaries between science and faith, myth and history, human and other, are increasingly blurred, the Nephilim offer a canvas for exploring those tensions. They are a mirror reflecting humanity's desire for mystery, our suspicion of official narratives, and our yearning for a time when the world was bigger, stranger, and filled with beings that challenged our place in it. This doesn't mean academia dismisses the Nephilim entirely. They remain important as a cultural and theological artifact, revealing how ancient Israel interacted with and reinterpreted the mythologies of its neighbors. But the mainstream view holds firm. The Nephilim are part of humanity's mythic heritage, not its fossil record. Still, for every academic dismissal, there is a counterclaim waiting in the wings. In the next part, we will turn back to the contested evidence, artifacts, anomalies, and testimonies that refuse to fit neatly into the official framework, keeping the Nephilim mystery alive in the minds of those unwilling to let it rest. In the quiet wings of museums, in locked drawers of university collections, and in remote landscapes far from tourist trails, there are objects and structures that seem to defy the neat timelines of conventional history. They are the anomalies, the outliers that don't quite fit the accepted story. For most archaeologists, these are puzzles to be solved within the framework of human ingenuity. But for those who see the Nephilim not as myth but as memory, these are potential fingerprints of a lost race. One of the most debated sites is Baalbek's Temple of Jupiter platform in Lebanon. While the Romans expanded and built upon the site, the foundation blocks, some weighing over 800 tons, appear older, their weathering and placement suggesting an origin predating the Roman construction. The largest block still lies in the quarry nearby, the Stone of the Pregnant Woman, estimated at over 1,000 tons. How these stones were cut, moved, and positioned with such precision remains unanswered in mainstream scholarship. Heavy-lift cranes today would struggle with the task. The ancient builders did it with tools we have yet to reconstruct. Proponents of the Nephilim theory see this as monumental work done by beings with strength or technology beyond the human norm. In South America, the walls of Sacsayhuaman in Peru are made of enormous polygonal stones, some over 100 tons, fitted so tightly that a knife blade cannot slide between them. Archaeologists attribute the construction to the Inca, yet the Inca themselves told early Spanish chroniclers they had inherited the site from an earlier, unknown people. Local legends speak of giants who once walked the Andes and built with stones as easily as a child plays with blocks. The Golan Heights in the Levant, not far from the biblical Bashan, the land of the giant king Og, holds a strange structure known as Rujum el-Hiri. From the air, it appears as concentric rings of massive stone enclosing a central tumulus. The stones total over 40,000 tons, and the site's purpose remains unclear. Some archaeologists suggest it was an astronomical calendar. Others believe it was a ceremonial center. In Nephilim-related speculation, its location in ancient Rephaim territory and its scale hint at a connection to the giants of biblical memory. Anomalous artifacts also stir controversy. In Ecuador, a cache of oversized stone tools was reportedly discovered, each far too large for an ordinary human to wield comfortably. In North America, the so-called Loveland stone and other inscribed rocks carry markings that do not match known indigenous scripts, prompting theories of contact with a lost, possibly pre-human civilization. While mainstream scholars attribute these to misinterpretation or hoaxes, enthusiasts note the recurring pattern: large-scale tools and unexplained inscriptions appearing in regions tied to giant legends. The elongated skulls of Paracas, Peru, add another layer to the puzzle. While many elongated skulls worldwide are the result of intentional cranial deformation, some Paracas specimens have cranial volumes up to 25% larger than the human average, with structural differences that critics say cannot be explained by binding alone. DNA tests conducted by independent researchers, though not universally accepted, have reported unusual haplogroups not common to the region. To those following the Nephilim trail, these skulls could represent a hybrid population, perhaps descended from the same pre-flood beings described in Enoch. Then there are the giant steps carved into bedrock in places like Pumapunku, Bolivia, and Gornaya Shoria, Russia. These massive, stair-like features appear far larger than necessary for human use, leading to speculation they were built for beings of greater stature. Mainstream explanations range from natural erosion to ceremonial architecture, but the sheer scale keeps the mystery alive. Even in the oceans, anomalies spark debate. Off the coast of Yonaguni, Japan, lies an underwater formation with terraces, steps, and sharp angles that some believe are the remains of a submerged city. Geologists argue it is a natural sandstone formation shaped by tectonic activity, but divers and alternative researchers see human or non-human design. If the site was once above water, it would date back to a time before the end of the last ice age, aligning with the hypothesized era of the Nephilim's pre-flood civilization. Written records occasionally hint at physical encounters with giants. In 1912, miners in Lovelock Cave, Nevada, unearthed mummified remains reportedly over 7 feet tall, along with sandals over 15 inches long. Some of the artifacts are still on display in small museums, but the largest skeletal remains have vanished into private collections or been lost, fueling suspicions of deliberate suppression. Similar stories come from the Aleutian Islands, where Russian explorers in the 18th century reported finding skeletons of extraordinary stature in ancient burial sites. Skeptics counter that every one of these anomalies has plausible explanations that do not require a lost race of giants. The Baalbek stones, they argue, could have been moved with ancient engineering techniques and massive labor forces. The polygonal walls of Peru might be the product of centuries of trial and error construction by skilled masons. The Paracas skulls could be extreme examples of cranial binding. In this view, the anomalies are not evidence of the Nephilim. They are reminders of humanity's capacity for innovation and artistry. And yet, the anomalies remain stubborn. Each may have an explanation, but taken together, they form a pattern that mirrors the legends. Oversized works, unusual skeletal remains, mysterious alignments, and technologies hinted at, but not fully understood. For those unwilling to dismiss the Nephilim narrative, these scattered pieces are like fragments of a shattered mirror, each reflecting part of a larger picture we can no longer see whole. The greatest challenge in connecting these anomalies to the Nephilim is the lack of direct, testable evidence. No artifact bears the inscription, "Property of the Nephilim." No skeleton has been recovered, documented, and authenticated beyond dispute. What exists instead is a web of circumstantial hints, cultural parallels, and unexplained feats of construction. For believers, this is enough to keep the question open. For skeptics, it is precisely why the question should remain in the realm of myth. In the next part of our journey, we will look beyond physical remains to the realm of influence, exploring how the Nephilim myth, true or not, has shaped modern culture, from literature and film to conspiracy theories and speculative science. This is where ancient shadows stretch into the present day. Though their biblical mention spans only a few lines, the Nephilim have enjoyed a second life in the modern imagination, one that, in some ways, is far more vivid and detailed than anything preserved in the ancient record. Across novels, films, graphic novels, video games, and even music, the Nephilim have become flexible cultural icons, sometimes heroes, sometimes villains, sometimes metaphors for forces beyond human control. In this reimagined form, they are no longer confined to the pages of Genesis. They roam freely through the terrain of popular culture. In literature, the Nephilim have been recast as tragic anti-heroes, misunderstood beings caught between worlds. Fantasy authors like Cassandra Clare, in her Mortal Instruments series, reimagine them as protectors, part angel, part human, tasked with defending humanity from darker forces. This inversion of their biblical role reflects a broader trend in modern storytelling. The sympathetic monster, whose moral complexity challenges the black and white morality of earlier myths. While purists might scoff at such liberties, the emotional power of these reinterpretations ensures their continued popularity. In the realm of science fiction, writers have used the Nephilim as narrative stand-ins for alien-human hybrids, weaving them into tales of ancient astronauts and interstellar colonization. Authors influenced by Zecharia Sitchin's Earth Chronicles depict the Nephilim as direct products of extraterrestrial genetic engineering, left behind as both rulers and experiments. These speculative works borrow liberally from archaeology, astronomy, and conspiracy theory. blending real-world artifacts with fictionalized backstories to create plausible-seeming alternate histories. Cinema has embraced the Nephilim as visual spectacle. In Darren Aronofsky's Noah, 2014, they appear as towering rock-like beings, fallen angels trapped in monstrous forms, helping humanity under the shadow of divine judgment. Though heavily stylized, their presence in a major Hollywood production brought the Nephilim into mainstream conversation, prompting audiences unfamiliar with the term to explore its biblical roots. In other films, like the Prophecy series, they are subtle players, hidden in human form, manipulating events from the shadows. Video games have taken the Nephilim myth even further, often using the name as shorthand for immense power and ancient mystery. In franchises like Darksiders and Devil May Cry, Nephilim are supernatural warriors straddling the line between angelic and demonic realms. These portrayals tend to emphasize combat prowess, supernatural abilities, and an ambiguous moral code, catering to a medium where myth often serves as a backdrop for high-intensity action. The music industry has not been immune to their influence. Metal bands, particularly within subgenres like symphonic and black metal, have used Nephilim as lyrical and thematic anchors, evoking rebellion, ancient grandeur, and cosmic struggle. The British Gothic rock band Fields of the Nephilim even built an entire aesthetic around the name, merging Old Testament imagery with Western occultism and cinematic visuals. Outside of entertainment, the Nephilim thrive in the ecosystem of modern conspiracy theory. In online forums, podcasts, and self-published books, they are presented as key figures in a grand narrative of suppressed history. Theories range from the claim that world governments are hiding physical evidence of their existence to the belief that certain political elites are direct descendants of these ancient hybrids. For some, the Nephilim are tied to secret societies, underground bases, and advanced technologies hoarded away from the public. A recurring theme in these fringe theories is the idea of deliberate cover-up. Most famously, the so-called Smithsonian suppression, which alleges that the institution has systematically removed giant skeletons from the archaeological record to protect the conventional historical timeline. Though the Smithsonian denies these claims and no verifiable evidence has been produced, the theory persists, feeding into a broader distrust of academic and governmental authority. In pseudoscientific speculation, the Nephilim are sometimes linked to enigmatic archaeological sites. Fringe researchers suggest they were the original builders of megalithic structures from Göbekli Tepe to Nan Madol. Others weave them into the mystery of Atlantis, claiming the fabled lost civilization was a Nephilim stronghold destroyed by a cataclysm remembered as the biblical flood. In such narratives, the Nephilim become architects of human culture, seeding languages, technologies, and belief systems before vanishing or being erased from history. This modern revival has been amplified by the Internet, where images of supposed giant skeletons, many of them digital manipulations, circulate widely, often with sensational headlines. Social media algorithms reward mystery and outrage, allowing speculative claims about the Nephilim to travel farther and faster than academic rebuttals. In this environment, the line between curiosity and conviction often blurs, and myth can become, for some, an article of faith. But the modern Nephilim are not only a product of fantasy or fringe belief, they also serve as cultural symbols. In literature and art, they can represent the outsider, the hybrid, the one who belongs to two worlds, but is fully accepted by neither. They can embody human ambition reaching beyond its limits, or the inevitable downfall of unchecked power. In this way, their endurance mirrors that of other mythic archetypes. They survive because they are adaptable, able to shift meaning to fit the concerns of each new era. Ironically, the more the Nephilim are reimagined, the further they drift from the sparse biblical verses that birthed them. The ancient writers might scarcely recognize the beings that now bear the name. And yet, this very mutability is what keeps them alive. Where the historical record is thin, imagination fills the gaps, sometimes recklessly, sometimes brilliantly, always driven by a hunger for the extraordinary. As the Nephilim stride across the stages of pop culture, conspiracy, and speculative history, they carry with them the tension between skepticism and wonder. We may know they are literary constructs, or we may believe they are echoes of a buried truth. But either way, they have become part of the cultural landscape, woven into the stories we tell about where we come from and what might still lie hidden in the past. In the next part, we will turn toward the philosophical. Beyond their entertainment value and their contested historicity, what do the Nephilim say about humanity's self-image? Why do we invent or preserve beings that tower over us, challenge us, and blur the line between divine and mortal? In that question lies perhaps the deepest reason they refuse to vanish from our collective memory. When we speak of the Nephilim, whether as literal beings or symbolic constructs, we are also speaking about ourselves. Myths are mirrors, and in the towering, half-divine figures of the Nephilim, humanity sees both its highest ambitions and its darkest warnings. The fascination is not only with the beings themselves, but with what they represent. The eternal human desire to reach beyond the limits of our nature and the inevitable consequences when we do. On one level, the Nephilim can be read as archetypes of overreach. In many cultures, giants embody the hubris of those who challenge divine order. The Greek Titans rebel against the Olympians, only to be cast into Tartarus. In Norse mythology, the Jötnar repeatedly push against the walls of Asgard, forcing confrontations that end in destruction. The biblical Nephilim fit this pattern. Born of unions that defy divine boundaries, they become symbols of a world spiraling toward judgment. In this light, they warn us about the perils of power without restraint, of mixing the sacred and the profane. Yet there is also an aspirational element. Giants are larger than life, and part of us longs to be as they are, stronger, wiser, more enduring than our fragile human selves. Psychologically, they represent the amplified version of our own potential. The more we imagine we could be if we could overcome the frailties of our bodies and the brevity of our years. This duality, envy and fear, explains why giants in myth are rarely purely good or purely evil. They are complex, ambiguous, and therefore deeply human in a paradoxical way. Carl Jung might have called the Nephilim a manifestation of the shadow, those parts of ourselves we project outward because they are too vast, too dangerous, or too unsettling to integrate directly. In this reading, the Nephilim are our disowned power. We tell stories about them to keep that power at arm's length, framing it as something alien or forbidden, even as we remain drawn to it. The myth also speaks to a deeper, almost primal need. the yearning for a time when the world felt bigger. Modernity has mapped and measured the planet, explained the stars, and broken the atom. But in doing so, it has also shrunk the space for mystery. The Nephilim, like Atlantis, the lost tribes, or ancient alien visitors, restore that sense of vastness. They whisper of a time when the known world was only a fragment of the real, when the boundaries between the human and the divine, the natural and the supernatural, were thin and permeable. Philosophically, the Nephilim also raise questions about the nature of humanity itself. If they were hybrids, whether with angels, gods, or extraterrestrials, then what does that say about the definition of human? Are we a closed species, bound by biology and evolution? Or is our story one of contact, blending, and transformation? Even as metaphor, this is provocative. It suggests that our identity is not fixed, that the line between us and other is negotiable, perhaps even illusory. Some theologians argue that the Nephilim myth functions as a commentary on corruption, not just moral decay, but the literal pollution of what was meant to be pure. In this view, the Genesis account warns against the mixing of orders, heavenly and earthly, that God intended to remain separate. Whether one accepts the theological premise or not, the underlying principle resonates in other contexts, the fear of losing something essential in the pursuit of gain, the risk of altering ourselves beyond recognition. There is also a political dimension. In the ancient world, as we've seen, rulers often claimed descent from divine or giant ancestors to legitimize their authority. The Nephilim myth can therefore be read as a subversive counter-narrative, a way of saying that such unions lead not to greatness but to ruin, and that power rooted in transgression is destined for destruction. This interpretation would make the Nephilim story not just a cosmic drama, but also a critique of human systems. On the psychological level, the endurance of the Nephilim reflects our attraction to liminality, to figures that exist between categories. We are fascinated by the in-between, twilight instead of day or night, myth instead of history or fiction, beings that are neither fully human nor wholly other. The Nephilim sit in that liminal space, inviting endless reinterpretation because they are never fully defined. They are vague enough to be adapted to any fear or hope we project onto them. The myth also engages with the universal theme of memory and loss. If the Nephilim existed, they are gone. If they did not, they represent something we have imagined and then forgotten. Either way, they are a ghost of possibility. We are haunted by the idea that there were once beings who knew more than we do, who could do more than we can, and whose disappearance left a hole in the fabric of our story. That hole becomes a space for both mourning and imagination. In modern philosophical discourse, the Nephilim sometimes appear in conversations about transhumanism. As we contemplate altering our genetics, merging with artificial intelligence, and extending our lifespans, we edge toward becoming our own Nephilim, hybrids of humanity and something beyond. The ancient warning about such unions, then, is freshly relevant. Are we stepping into the same territory that, according to myth, brought an earlier world to destruction? Or are we simply fulfilling a destiny as old as the stories themselves? Ultimately, the Nephilim endure because they allow us to talk about power, its allure, its danger, its consequences, without directly indicting ourselves. They are an externalized form of our internal struggle. the battle between wanting to be more than human and fearing what that more might cost us. In that sense, whether they walked the earth or not, they remain real because the questions they embody are still with us. In the next part, we will turn to the most elusive and speculative arena of all, the possibility that, somewhere in the world, remnants of the Nephilim, whether in bloodline, artifact, or forgotten knowledge, might still exist, waiting to be uncovered. The Nephilim, according to the traditional reading of the biblical narrative, perished long ago, either in the waters of the flood or in the campaigns that followed. Yet in whispers, fringe publications, and the accounts of a few daring explorers, the possibility remains that their story did not end in antiquity. The idea is intoxicating, that somewhere in the hidden folds of the earth, fragments of that ancient race still exist. For those who believe, the trail begins with bloodlines. Some researchers claim that certain royal and aristocratic families, particularly in Europe and the Middle East, carry the genetic legacy of the Nephilim. They point to the towering stature of medieval knights described in chronicles, to genealogies that trace noble houses back to semi-mythical ancestors, and to physical anomalies, unusually large skeletal frames, elongated skull shapes that appear sporadically in historical remains. In this narrative, the Nephilim never truly disappeared. They merged with humanity, their influence diluted but never extinguished. Others turn their attention to remote, underexplored regions. In the highlands of Afghanistan, soldiers during the early 2000s told stories of encountering a giant of Kandahar, a massive humanoid over 12 feet tall, with flaming red hair and a face both human and inhuman. The tale, recounted on certain podcasts and online forums, describes an intense firefight and the subsequent removal of the body by helicopter to an undisclosed location. No photographs or official reports confirm the incident, yet the story persists, bolstered by alleged military whistleblowers. In South America's Amazon basin, local tribes speak of forest beings of extraordinary height and strength, rarely seen but always feared. Some explorers report finding massive footprints deep in regions untouched by modern settlement. These impressions, measuring over 2 feet in length, are quickly dismissed by mainstream scientists as hoaxes or misinterpretations, yet they fuel the belief that something large and elusive still moves through the dense canopy. In the Pacific, the island of Guam preserves legends of the Tautaomona, ancient giants said to have built the latte stones, massive pillars that still dot the landscape. While archaeologists attribute these to the Chamorro people, some locals insist the stones predate their ancestors, the work of beings who vanished into the jungles or retreated beneath the earth. The notion of subterranean refuge is a recurring theme in modern Nephilim lore. Hollow Earth theorists propose that ancient giants, or their descendants, escaped underground to vast caverns lit by bioluminescent flora, emerging only rarely into the surface world. Stories of massive humanoids sighted near cave systems in the American West, particularly in Nevada and Utah, are cited as evidence. The Lovelock Cave legend, with its alleged discovery of red-haired giant mummies in the early 20th century, is often woven into this hypothesis. There are even claims, though unverifiable, that modern genetic research has stumbled upon anomalies suggestive of non-standard human origins. Independent labs testing unusual skeletal remains have reported sequences that do not match known human haplogroups, though such findings are routinely dismissed by academic institutions as contamination or faulty methodology. For believers, these rejections are part of a larger pattern of suppression, a modern echo of the cover-up narrative that has long surrounded giant-related discoveries. Expeditions to prove the Nephilim's survival often occupy a strange space between adventure and obsession. Self-funded explorers have trekked into the mountains of Patagonia, spurred on by accounts from early European sailors who described meeting giant natives. Others have ventured into the remote reaches of Papua New Guinea, drawn by reports of tribes that guard stories of colossal ancestors who once ruled the coasts. Few return with tangible evidence, but the journeys themselves add to the legend, creating new layers of narrative for others to follow. Satellite imagery, too, has become part of the hunt. Online researchers scour high-resolution maps for anomalies, massive humanoid silhouettes on glaciers, inexplicable depressions in deserts, shadowy shapes in deep jungles. Most are tricks of light, digital artifacts, or natural formations, but every so often an image emerges that resists easy explanation, sparking brief flurries of speculation before vanishing into the noise of the internet. Skeptics argue that the survival of a giant humanoid species into the modern era is all but impossible. The requirements for sustaining such a large body, massive caloric intake, vast territories, would make them extremely vulnerable to detection. And yet the same argument has been made about other elusive creatures, like the giant squid, whose existence was confirmed only in the 21st century, despite centuries of sailors' tales. For those who seek the Nephilim in the present, the appeal is not solely in the physical proof. It is in the idea that something has escaped the net of modern surveillance and classification, that not every mystery has been solved, not every page of history has been turned. The Nephilim, real or imagined, represent a remnant of the mythic world that refuses to be extinguished. In the most romantic telling, these beings watch us still, from mountain passes, from dense jungles, from the hidden corners of deserts and seas, knowing that the age of giants has passed but unwilling or unable to step fully into extinction. Whether this is true or not may matter less than the persistence of the idea itself. For as long as the possibility exists, there will be those who look to the horizon and wonder if somewhere, just beyond the reach of our maps, the last of the Nephilim still walks. In our final part, we will leave the realm of evidence and return to the realm of mystery, to close our journey not with certainty, but with an image, a thought, a shadow that invites us to keep searching. The desert was quiet in the way only ancient places can be, where even the wind moves carefully, as though unwilling to disturb whatever lies beneath the surface. I had walked for hours toward the low ridge, guided only by the coordinates a local shepherd had given me. He had said nothing more, only smiled, touched 2 fingers to his lips, and pointed toward the horizon. The ground here was different from the surrounding plains. The stones were larger, older, their edges worn smooth by centuries of heat and dust. A faint pattern ran through them. Not a road, not quite, but the suggestion of one, as if the earth still remembered where the weight of something immense had once passed. I reached the crest of the ridge as the sun began to sink, and there it was, an impression in the rock, shallow but unmistakable. It was a footprint, longer than my arm from shoulder to fingertips, the heel cupped deep enough to hold water from a passing rain. The toes fanned wide, their edges eroded into soft curves, but the proportions were human. Too human. Kneeling beside it, I placed my own boot inside the print. My foot looked like that of a child. Around the edges, tiny shoots of grass had found a way to grow, their green startling against the red stone. It struck me then that whatever had made this mark had not been here for a very long time, and yet the shape had survived, through storms, through the grinding of sand, through the passage of entire civilizations. There was no plaque, no protective fence, no mention on any map. Just the print, the fading day, and the silence. I thought of all the places where I had chased the Nephilim. Dusty museum storerooms, libraries with forbidden manuscripts, remote valleys with names I could barely pronounce. Each had offered fragments, a story here, a stone there, whispers passed from elder to child. And yet here, in this unmarked corner of the world, was something more tangible than all of it. The rational part of my mind whispered possibilities, natural erosion, an unusual rock formation, the human tendency to find patterns where none exist. But another part, a deeper, older part, stood in quiet defiance. Because in that moment, under the dying light, the footprint did not feel like a trick of nature. It felt like a message. I leaned back, letting my hands press into the warm rock. Above me, the sky shifted into the deep blues and violets of night, the first stars flickering into view. Somewhere far away, beyond deserts and oceans, other people were turning on their lights, locking their doors, stepping into the routines of an ordinary evening. Here, though, there was nothing ordinary. I tried to imagine the being who had left this mark. Was it a solitary wanderer, pausing for a moment before vanishing into the distance? Or was it part of a procession, a people on the move, their steps carving an unbroken path toward some forgotten horizon? Did they know they would be remembered? Or was this print just an accident of passing, a casual press of weight that happened to outlast its maker? The air cooled as the sun vanished completely, and the desert's quiet deepened. My own breath sounded too loud. I felt the weight of time pressing in, the sense that I was not alone. Not in the literal sense, but in the way that a place can hold on to its history so tightly that the past feels almost present. I stood slowly, brushing the dust from my knees. The ridge stretched away into darkness, disappearing into shapes the eye could not quite fix. Somewhere out there, I thought, there might be another print. And another. Perhaps a whole trail, if one knew how to look. I turned to leave, but after a few steps, I glanced back. The footprint was still there, cradling a small pool of water from last night's rare rain. In the fading light, the reflection of the first evening star trembled on its surface. For a moment, it looked like an eye staring upward, unblinking, as if watching for something, or someone, that had not yet returned. I walked down the slope without looking back again, letting the darkness close in around me. Somewhere in the silence, my mind's ear imagined a sound that was not my own steps. A heavier tread, slow and deliberate, following just far enough behind to never be seen. By the time I reached the plain, the stars were bright and sharp, scattered across the sky in patterns older than every story I had ever heard. I thought of the constellations our ancestors charted, the same ones the builders of megaliths had aligned their stones to, the same ones that might have been familiar to those beings, whether giants of earth or travelers from beyond. The wind picked up, carrying with it the dry scent of stone and a faint trace of rain. I pulled my jacket tighter, but the chill was not from the air. It was from the knowledge that the mark I had seen was real, and that reality does not always offer explanations. Ahead of me, the land was empty, but my mind kept returning to that single print, its scale, its depth, its improbable endurance. I could not prove what had made it. Perhaps no one ever would. But somewhere in the unlit spaces of the world, in deserts and mountains and oceans, there are other marks waiting. Not all of them can be measured, photographed, or catalogued. Some are meant only to be found by those who are willing to walk far enough, listen long enough, and believe, if only for the length of a single breath, that the giants may still be walking.